Microcosm, Ancient Civilizations. This is a series running off of a book that's going to come out shortly based on a column that came out around the year 2000 called End Times. The book's called Millennia and Microcosm, and it's an exercise in learning to have more than one worldview in your head at a time and be able to switch between them voluntarily, which is not easy to do. Today, I'm going to lead us on a little tour through some of Kenneth Smith's favorite philosophical fragments that sort of, I think, help to set the case for this book. And if we ever do a foreword to this book, we might put these things together. I'll talk to him about it and see if he's interested. But the premise is something near and dear to Stephen's heart, and that's about the limits and liabilities of reason and rationalism, and the various dangers they can get us into. And it's not that Kenneth is opposed to reason or rationalism, it's that Kenneth is opposed to using that faculty and not also using the other fundamental faculty of the mind, which reason can only understand as irrationality because it only sees itself as the positive and everything else as the negative. But there is a different way to look at it that Hegel and others have explored. This idea that you have an experiential faculty, and then on top of that, you develop this rationalist planning, systematizing faculty that grows out of it. Hegel talks about this as a dialectical relationship, as between the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, and says that the biggest weakness in Kant is Kant can't explain where reason comes from. He can't explain why so many people fall short of his standard of reason. He writes as though it's a binary and you either hit that standard or you don't hit that standard. The idea that there's a whole development path between them and that reason arises out of irrationality, and that irrationality is the more fundamental faculty of the mind. And without it, you can't reason at all. All of this is missing from Kant, and it's Hegel's addition. And where things get interesting is when people react to Hegel and they begin to not only embrace his dialectic of the development of the mind, but also point out the many, many ways in which he himself fell short of his own philosophical system. And we're going to talk about some of that today. And we're going to do that because it plays directly into this existentialist tradition of epistemology, which wants to know, why do we think the ways that we do, and why is it that our thinking sometimes is so productive and sometimes is so unhealthy? How is it that the mental processes are so hit and miss? Why aren't they consistent? That's something the young Hegelians, aka the followers but critics of Hegel, have a fun time exploring. Nietzsche, for example, Kafka, Kierkegaard. They all dig into this, and today we're going to take a little tour of some of these issues, and we're going to go back to the roots. We're going to go back to Heraclitus, which Hegel said was where he dug all this stuff up, and we're going to show how the things that Hegel gets right and the things that Hegel gets wrong are both forecast by Heraclitus effectively, and that there are lessons for us to take forward out of this. I'm going to call on Phil in a second, but I'm going to start us with a Nietzsche quote. And he says, "Philosophy is only for the healthy, the sick it has ever made sicker." And this is a quote that most philosophers don't care for. They might bant it around to be edgy, but when they say it, they only ever mean that they themselves must be the healthy and the people they're criticizing must be the sick, right? People only ever use it as though it were a sword with only one edge. And in doing so, they're actually violating the very thing that Nietzsche is trying to warn us about, which is that it is we ourselves who need to be the main object of our criticism as philosophers. If we adopt what we think of as the tools of philosophy primarily as a method to club our opponents over the head with and pat ourselves on the head as the best and the brightest, we're not actually engaging in philosophy. We're engaging in this other thing that he criticizes and that Kierkegaard criticizes, and Kafka and numerous others. And we're gonna be exploring some of that today. So we'll start with that, Nietzsche. But for the moment, why don't I kick things off by calling on Phil?
Yeah, like we did mention Parmenides, so I was thinking over that as we mentioned it. It seems to me like I guess the two really important pre-Socratic figures was Parmenides and Heraclitus, and it seems to me they're both about a kind of negation. Parmenides was proposing that uh, there's a difference between appearance and reality, and that appearance is not reality. Reality is therefore things don't move, and that was obviously wrong. And the Greeks been trying to figure that out, and they did it through the logic of negation, negating that, and the whole history of that. I think that might have set up the whole notion of metaphysics. And Parmenides saw negation as the visible and the invisible, which is quite different. I mean, in other words, except that the appearances are partially true, that it hides other parts. So the negation is the negation of finding what's beneath the visible part, the hidden part. And so that's a different kind of negation that doesn't reject it appear on to begin with. I think that contrast between the two, I think is important. I think I would be interested in some ways to get a little bit deeper, not in this session, not with you guys, because you're committed so much to Heraclitus, to actually look through the other aspect, which essentially led it to a kind of a funny half truth in a funny way, right? Because it just negated what appearance was, rather than accepting the appearance was at least partially true. So that's a comment I want to make. But the both, it's interesting, they're both about negation in different ways, a limited negation and a kind of absolute total negation. So I'll leave it at that, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, we see in Parmenides, with his insistence that his entire philosophy can be derived from the sentence "being is," we see him pushing hard on the use of logic and logical derivation in an attempt to prove things that are part of our real everyday experience are not in fact real at all. And you see this a lot with Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno was a follower of Parmenides. He felt it was his job to defend Parmenides from the hoi polloi who would say things like, what do you mean this apple I'm eating right now is not real? What do you mean this river flowing is not real? What do you mean nothing around us is real? And Zeno would attempt to set up logical paradoxes to prove that they can't even take a step. Nobody's allowed to move anywhere. That you can prove that it's impossible to take even a single step, and therefore, when you take steps, it must not really be happening. And paradoxes like this being used to defeat the intelligence, and more importantly, to defeat the experience of the questioner, was part and parcel of the Parmenides system, because the whole thing was based on this radical denial. But built into that, there is a negation. You're right, and the negation takes a number of forms. One of the forms is, he is adhering to the law of the excluded middle. In order to, you can't lean that hard on logic without becoming an absolutist about the law of the excluded middle, and he and Zeno do very hard. And in excluding the middle, they're therefore excluding all of the gray parts of reality. They're insisting on black and white in order to make it fit their logical syllogisms. And in doing so, that then sets them up to deny change, because change is notoriously slippery. If I'm changing, well, which me am I? Am I the me from before the change, or am I the me from after the change? I can't be both, because being is. So I must be a thing. I must have an identity. If my identity is changing, then I don't have an identity anymore, says Parmenides. Ergo, I must not actually be changing, and it's all an illusion. And thus you can see how the philosophy of eternal forms gets derived out of this as a way to rationalize how all of this could just be shadows, and the pure, perfect, unchanging forms are the actual real things that that we're all just shadows of. Anybody who's read science fiction and fantasy, Roger Zelazny had a series in the 70s called the Amber Chronicles, the Chronicles of Amber. And they're based on the idea that there's only one eternal world and every other world is just a shadow of it. And the heroes are these godlike beings who can shadow walk. They can hop from world to world because none of them are real anyway. They're just reflections of themselves who are the only real people. I got to say, there's an enormous amount of solipsism and narcissism that you see reflected in this, and it all derives directly from Parmenides. But Parmenides wasn't inclined to attribute that flaw to himself. There's a debate about whether Heraclitus wrote before or after or at the same time as Parmenides. I don't know that we'll ever resolve it because some of these dates are notoriously slippery about exactly when were these people alive. But Heraclitus reads interestingly one way if he was the original stater of this philosophy of flux, and then Parmenides comes out and says, nuh-uh. But it's also interesting if Parmenides comes out and says, there's no change, everything's an illusion, there's only these eternal, unchanging things. And then it's Heraclitus who's coming out and going, nuh-uh. But almost certainly they had to be reacting to each other because you couldn't get clearer polar opposites than their descriptions of reality. Donald, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, we can mock Parmenides all we like, but being has only manifested itself once. All beings are from the one being.
Yes, according to Parmenides.
Well, there are these multiverse, type physicists today, but I don't think you need to take them that seriously. But we have what there is, and it all came into being at one time. There have not been multiple creative events. And there is some sense in which Parmenides, just like life evolved, not individual things. It's all one, and it came together. Okay, I'll stop defending these people.
Well, you don't have to stop because, Heraclitus himself says that people fail to understand that all things are one. And, when he says that, you're like, wait a minute, isn't that Parmenides? What are you saying? Are you saying you're agreeing with Parmenides? But then in the next sentence, he turns around and says, but the nature of existence is not the unchanging nature that Parmenides says it is. The Big Bang and the evolution of the elements, there's a number of interesting arguments around this. One thing that's not argued is that the elements that are available from which, the cosmos is made, including our very bodies, most of those elements weren't present at the time of the Big Bang. There was a massive explosion of particle soup out of which hydrogen and other things precipitated. And some elements are still being formed today, but via, processes going on within stars. You not only get helium from hydrogen, but you can also, calcium develops in stars. A number of elements are developed there. And of course, you've got novas and supernovas that are ongoing throughout the cosmos, developing elements. So there is this flow of derivation and development, which is the same kind of flow of derivation and development we see in the growth of a tree or in embryogenesis or in anything else. And yet, it's also true that all of these things are so intimately related to each other that there is a oneness to them. And so, when people put Parmenides and Heraclitus side by side as opposites, the philosopher of no change and the philosopher of radical flux, they're probably not accurately portraying either one of them. It's just a handy if distorting mnemonic, because Parmenides is attempting to explain the diversity we see, not merely say it's not there. And Heraclitus is trying to explain how underneath the diversity there is a unity in the logos of nature that rules over all of us.
Well, so, it is a cosmos, by the way.
Yeah.
It's well ordered.
E pluribus unum, right? Many from one, one from many. Okay, so let me call on the folks who have their hands up. I'm going to start with Ginny, who hasn't spoken yet today. Why don't you come off mute, Ginny, and tell us what's on your mind?
With respect to what Donald just said, Donald, haven't you heard there are a million universes out there? If that is the case, how could you just disregard multiverse concept? I absolutely do think, I believe that there could be multiverse. Anyway, yeah, I have opposite feelings regarding that than Donald. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you for the few minutes I'm in here to allow me to have a little comment. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Ginny. Good to hear from you. Well, you know, the trick with Donald is that you know, he's a joker. So you don't always know, is he actually saying he believes this, or is he putting it out for the sake of argument, or is he saying that the truth is more complicated than an either or proposition? And
well, I didn't know that Donald was a trickster. Okay, now I do. Okay,
you see that grin, right? He's doing it right now too. So, yeah.
So especially we're on mythos here. You know, I think these are stories in some ways told by Parmenides and by Heraclitus that,
well, I don't
find what you can of value in them. You know?
Yeah, but I don't think during the time of Parmenides, I don't think they thought anything about million universes out there, you know. But I think with the discovery of what since then, yeah, I absolutely do believe that it's possible. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's always interesting to live during these changing times, because you know the ideas about cosmology, for example, even just in my own life, have changed tremendously. And if you kind of spend a little bit of time on Wikipedia and look at the history of astronomy in the 20th century, you discover that at the beginning of the 20th century, it's astonishing the things we didn't know. Like, we discovered galaxies. The fact that we're not just in a solar system among stars, but there's a real galaxy here, they didn't know that. And that's just a little time ago. They didn't know that hydrogen was the most abundant element in the cosmos. And, you know, it makes up, I don't know, 99% of the mass of the cosmos. But we didn't know that, right? Before the 20th century. The fact that the cosmos is expanding was discovered during the 20th century. All these things that we now think of as basic were completely unknown.
Kant had theorized galaxies in the Kant's Laplace system. He hadn't proved it, but he theorized that most likely these nebula were grand constructions of stars.
Yeah, we had premises and speculation, but you know, we didn't really know for sure until just the last.
Maybe Hubble. They built a telescope before 100-inch on Mount Wilson, and that was the one they used to take the photographs where they were able to resolve the galaxies into individual stars.
Yeah, it's astonishing. You know, I first got into astronomy as a little kid in the 70s. I had an aunt who'd finished up a college course on astronomy, and she was going to throw her textbook away, and I begged her to give it to me instead. And so, you know, I'm a little kid in elementary school pouring through these black and white photos and not entirely keeping up with the text, I'll tell you that much, but, you know, doing what I could with it. And I still have that textbook downstairs. And it's really surprising to go back to it and see what we thought in the 1970s was the nature of the cosmos. Like black holes, another example of a very, very, very recent discovery. It's like, you know, the 70s, I believe, and they were just speculating about them in this textbook.
I believe it was Kant who, in his own time, speculated that astronomy had gone as far as it would ever go.
Yeah, nothing more to learn. Yeah, you hear these prognostications in computer science too. The famous Bill Gates quote about how much RAM anybody would ever need is a riot. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things in response to Donald. Apparently, recently, the James Webb Telescope have discovered something that's beyond galaxies that existed beyond the time that it was supposed to exist. And that has thrown astronomy, theoretical astronomy, into complete I wouldn't say chaos, but questioning whether the whole idea of the Big Bang Theory is wrong. They're questioning that right now. And including Roger Penrose and Leonard Susskind. So there was one part that I always kind of disagree with Hegel, because Hegel's said at some point history will end because you would arrive at the essence of being. I constantly ask, well, and I asked it in terms of God, because God is supposedly that. I said, is God eternal, or is he also changing? In other words, being itself might be in the process of changing, not only projecting lowercase beings, but being itself might be changing. That might be part of the reason why beings with a lowercase b are in flux. That question was never answered. I don't think anybody was able to answer it, but I question that, number one. Number two, there's a puzzle about German that I've learned now, that nouns are quite often in capital letters. So in terms of German, apparently there's no distinction between uppercase being and lowercase being. We have to translate that. So that's a complex. And I proposed to one meeting group, I said, there's a kind of a solution that the Germans should look at. That is, I happen to know typography. There's something called small caps. Small caps are uppercase letters with the proportion and rest on the mean line of the lowercase letters. There's also another thing that the people who understand German a little bit better has made a smaller capital that actually, and that's all of the capitals, that tuck under the ascenders, so it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. So maybe that subtlety and maneuvering a big cap and a small cap that tuck under the ascender, which means that the small cap, in this case, not the real small cap, would be something that hides behind the bush, so it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. So perhaps there's something, I wouldn't say wrong with the German language, that it can't distinguish being from beings. So perhaps that could be solved in typography for those people who are subtle enough to understand typography. So I do not even know whether, if it's all caps, then I guess being, capital B, and beings, lowercase b, are the same thing. And they're definitely not the same thing as far as I'm concerned. So there's a confusion in language in translating German. And there might be a confusion in German itself. But German might be, if you understand German, not that I do, it might be that they understand it subtly. They know the distinction between being, capital B, and lowercase b in the context. So there's a problem technically in typography. Also a problem now, the Big Bang. In fact, I think Roger Penrose thinks that something might have happened before the Big Bang to cause the Big Bang. So if that's the case, we're throwing being in the big question scientifically.
Thanks, Phil. So kind of where I'm trying to get us to launch from is this Nietzsche quote. And I started with this quote from Webb's, which I've shared here. This is Kenneth Smith's book, Webb's, in which he says, philosophy is meaningful and indispensable only to those who see the gravity sink of perspectivism's rhetoric, egocentrism, popular conformism, the whole whorish business. And here he's referring not to, he and I had a long discussion about that word. He's referring not here to, you know, sexual prostitution. He's referring to people who are pleasers, who will do anything in order to make other people happy.
Yes, men.
What's that?
Yes, men.
Yes, men. A contagion of diseases that passes for communication among moderns. It's a mistake to address philosophy to those not already so living and thinking as to respect its stringencies, to those with neither eye nor ear for the normal and ordinary mendacity in our thoughtless discourse. Nietzsche is quite correct. Philosophy is only for healthy minds and personalities. The sick it has always made even sicker. In their hands, philosophy too becomes an ideology, a function of their narrowness. This is his expansion upon the man with the hammer problem, that, you know, if you are committed enough to the tool in your hand, there is no situation the world can present you with that you can't reinterpret as a nail to be hit with your hammer. That you know, the Procrustean bed of the mind has a godlike ability to reinterpret whatever it needs to fit the ideology that possesses it. And so here he's basically linking Nietzsche to Kierkegaard, and we'll come back to Kierkegaard in a moment. But Kierkegaard talked a lot about delusion and the problem with the way that we attach ourselves to ideologies in order to, and by so doing, we cut ourselves off from the evidence of the cosmos around us. And what a danger that is, says everybody in this Heraclitean tradition. Heraclitus is all about the need to attach ourselves to the evidence of the cosmos as a lever against our desire to believe our own opinions. So what he's arguing here is to somebody who doesn't hold their own opinions skeptically, who thinks that the fact that they're familiar with their ideas makes them true, or the fact that they want to believe means that it must be true. And ergo, if I can find some way to organize the evidence into logical syllogisms, I can prove that it's true, even if all the evidence is to the contrary. It's right up there with Zeno saying you can't even take a single step, because before that you'd have to take half a step, and before that you'd have to take half of that, and there's an infinite number of halves, and nobody can travel an infinite distance, and therefore you can't take a step. This is Zeno's paradox in a nutshell. He disproves motion by saying that, you know, all these infinities are too much for us and there's nothing to be done. And in that, it's a denial of the older cosmology of the Greeks, which Heraclitus talks about, which is that, yes, we are swimming in infinities. That is our natural water. And traversing infinities, whether with a step or with a thought, is just the natural metabolism of a human being. To attempt to, you know, prove it away because we don't like infinity is not, it's not going to lead anywhere except into ideology, is the argument. That sort of rhetoric. So this is what Nietzsche means when he says philosophy is only for healthy minds and personalities. He's saying you can't use, and this is the core point before I call on Stephen, you can't use philosophy to heal a sick mind, which is a huge disappointment to those of us who got into philosophy in the hopes that it would heal our sick minds. Nietzsche says, a sick mind has a near omnipotent capability to reinterpret things the way that pleases it. And the fact that it does so is the sickness. And if you hand it philosophy, philosophy is just like anything else. It's going to reinterpret philosophy in its own terms, to fit within the Procrustean bed, to become the nail that it wants to hit with its hammer. And the only antidote to that is for the person to desperately not want to do that. If you desperately don't want to do it, you can begin the process of noticing when you're doing it and separating yourself from that behavior. But if you haven't agreed that you do that, or worse, if you like that you do that, if you think that's fine, if you think that's what understanding is, and that you're perfectly well allowed to reinterpret anything you want to fit it within your ideological framework, then philosophy isn't going to make you better. It's going to make you worse. It's just going to give you more sophisticated rationalizations you can use to prop up your own ideology. This is Nietzsche's core argument here. And this is Kenneth Smith's core argument in this book. As long as you are bound by a single worldview, you are possessed by a galaxy of ideologies that are mutually self-reinforcing. And you have to want to escape it before you're going to be able to escape it. Because if you don't see that you have a problem, there's nothing the cosmos can show you or nothing anybody can tell you that could convince you that you have a problem. I'm well familiar with this from growing up in an alcoholic family. The whole, I don't have a problem. You know, this is my childhood, right? So I get this. You know, I'm. It's not that I'm especially smart. It's that I was unlucky enough to grow up in that kind of household, and it gave me all I needed to see through experience. You know, to arm me so that when I would read something like this in Nietzsche, I go, instead of going, no, I read it and I go, yeah, that's my life right there. He's talking about, I know all about how handing somebody the right tools can result in the wrong behavior if they don't have a commitment to trying to change their situation. So all of this, I bring this up because, look, I'm quoting from Webb's. This isn't in Millennia and Microcosm. I'm quoting from Webb's because he takes, you know, like the Greeks, Kenneth takes certain things for granted. And he's trying to explicate it all. He was trying to write it as a popular column in the Comics Journal. I mean, popular for certain values of popular. But he's still not fully cognizant of what the whole trail of breadcrumbs is. He's going to have to leave in the introduction to ramp people up to understand what he's asking of them in this book. So that's part of what today is about. And I'm, you know, I'm looking forward to the discussion that comes out of this. But part of what I'm going to be doing here is a trail of breadcrumbs of some of his favorite quotes and show how they point in the direction of the problem that this book is designed to solve. So, how about let's see, Joseph hasn't gone yet. So how about Joseph, then Stephen, then Donald?
Yeah, just something about how, you know, you start to look at these, you take a philosophy and you take it to match your worldview. And there are a lot of different examples of that. I mean, in the sense that where I think you could even say that Marxism was taken and to match an ideology of political leaders in the Soviet Union, so that it was kind of called Marxism, but it wasn't necessarily what Marx had exactly in mind. So that is one example, and there are also examples of how even religions in particular, dogmatic ones in particular, for which I have experience with, how they would incorporate different philosophers into some of their beliefs, as to say, well, this person is saying what we want to hear. And I'll give you one example. It's even a person that was in the Catholic religion. St. Thomas More was, canonized and is celebrated on many levels. And he's a patron saint for lawyers and things like that. But in very dogmatic communities, you can't read his book Utopia. And so this is a perfect example of how you can take and make a philosophy, or a philosopher in this particular instance, fit into your worldview. And it's kind of really scary, because it's on a number of levels, because of how it's used and how powerful it becomes. Like, it becomes almost a self-reinforcing loop where it distorts everything you see. There was another point I had, but it was a little bit more strong. But I'm doing a few things at once here, so I'm trying to balance three different things at once, but I will come back to it. So thanks.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I just add to reinforce what you're saying. The Marx is a classic example in which plenty of people who fervently believe they were Marxists actually believe things that Marx was against, you know, or they neglect things that Marx was for. Both kinds of mistakes. And you know, I sort of have this, I have this little private mythology that there are a number of figures in history who, if you could hook them up to a dynamo, you could power civilization from the speed with which they spin in their graves. From all the people who've misused and misunderstood the things that they said. You know, how many people set out to create a movement to change the world and try to teach people something, and you know, what they hoped was that somebody would listen, and what they didn't think about was, what if people listen but they completely misinterpret you and they start mass movements against everything you stood for in your name. You know, how about that? Is, you know, would that please you? And with Marx, you know, there's a couple of classics. When Ayala was on here, she pointed me to a humanist Marxist of the 20th century, whose name eludes me at the moment, who did a critique of Lenin's review of Marx, and showed, you know, Lenin wrote a book about his review of one of Marx's books, and he goes all the way through right up until the final paragraph, at which point he says, and at this point we're done and there's nothing more to see, so you know, we'll close our investigation here. And she points out that the next paragraph was about how Marx would have required you to apply the dialectic and self-scrutiny to your own political party, and you would have had to question your party and whether it was doing the right thing, and it would have had to change over time. The people who started out being in charge shouldn't stay in charge. All this kind of dialectics of organization, you know, Lenin stopped right before effectively Marx was criticizing what Lenin was doing, and said, "There's nothing more to see here. I'm done. I'm finished." La 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 la. The classic example, I was on a walk with my dad a couple of weeks ago in the 60s. He went through a huge Marx phase where he collected all of Marx's books and read them all. He's got the biggest Marx book collection I've ever seen. All the notebooks, all the odd obscure letters, he's read them all. And he says one of the he and I agreed on this point. One of the things about Marx is that he accepts Hegel's dialectic, and and they're both accepting Heraclitus's dialectic, and they're saying this is the way nature works. Nature works through transformation. Even when things hold still and seem to be at rest, there is dynamic energy at work keeping them that way. It's not a stasis, it's a dynamism. And that the dialectic is thus a real thing, not just some rhetorical ploy for winning an argument. And yet, you can find, if you Google, you can find plenty of would-be Hegelians and Marxists who will say, well, of course, Hegel and Marx were only using dialectic rhetorically, and they never meant the world actually works that way. It's just for purposes of argument. And you know, Hegel and Marx couldn't have been any clearer about the fact that they're describing reality, not just playing some trick to win an argument, but generations. Now, there's whole movements within Marxism. Generations of Marxists are absolutely convinced that no, they didn't really think the dialectic was real. That's just rhetoric. And if they can mistake that, they can mistake anything. You know, that's so core to both Marx and Hegel. And it just shows how far wrong people can go, even when the thing they're trying to do more than anything is to be true to what they're reading. You know, it's amazing. So that's just underscoring what you said. Basically, agreeing.
Yeah, and the opposite would be actually to constantly test your worldview and to try and disprove it.
Right.
I mean, so that's the counter to that. And actually, you see this in economics. To be quite honest, is to want somebody that was doing a study on this, coming up with a framework to how ideas would scale and actually work. And instead of making it work within one particular context and making an experiment work, what the better approach would be to try and really undermine the project that the idea, to test the resilience of the idea itself. And that kind of something needs to constantly be done. And if the idea still stands, after really trying to disprove it, that it will work across multiple markets in this particular instance. But again, that's the exact opposite of what academia is incentivized to do, right? They're incentivized to make studies work. right? They are incentivized to create a study, make it work. So the example that he gave was, he said he started a school that was local, and he hired, it was an experimental school, and he hired the worst or the best possible the way the school system was actually hiring teachers to mimic, to see if it could be replicated. He said, well, looking back at it, I would have hired the worst teachers to try and undermine my idea. And because he does, that would actually test the idea. But this is just the exact opposite of somebody that makes something to fit their worldview.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So thanks for bringing that up. I'm going to call on Hans again in a second, but I'll just add, I guess my very favorite missing of the point, you can find philosophers who believe that Hegel did not believe in change, that in fact he believed in stasis. And they use the river quote to prove it. They say you can't step twice in the same river. They say, so he admits there's a river. So he believes that, the river is always there, and therefore nothing's really changing. And so therefore there's no disagreement with Parmenides. And I mean, you could Google that and find it not just from, laymen, but serious modernist philosophers make this argument. And I think even Wikipedia, the article on Heraclitus, still has a reference to one of the guys who argued that Heraclitus was not a philosopher of change, and that's a radical misunderstanding and misreading, and actually he didn't believe in change. Now, if you can read Heraclitus and think that he thinks nothing changes, you can think anything is anything else. I mean, he couldn't be clearer, right? So, Stephen, then Donald, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
In my long-standing debates with the rationalists in my own city, it's my observation that they misunderstand rationalism. The people that seem to understand rationalism the least are the rationalists, and they've mistaken rationalism for idealism. We start off this point. We have something we vaguely think is reality, and we develop ideas about reality as a tool, and we think how wonderful that we can develop ideas about reality. And we, as you said, adopt the prejudice that our ideas are somewhat perfect. And I thought these people call themselves a rationalists are more idealists than anything else. They believe they can bludgeon reality with their ideas. And rationalism is not that. Rationalism is questioning your own ideas. It's trying to sift through your ideas and saying, do these ideas actually work out? You're measuring your ideas. You're seeing which ideas measure up. There's a problem there because your rationalism is always going to be dependent on your primary rationales, and the primary rationales tend to be posited. They're not necessary truths as far as I can figure out. You've come to a conclusion, this is a really good rule of thumb, and I'll judge the rest of my thoughts by it. And your rationale will be as weak as your primary measure. And I just stand amazed at all these people that think they're philosophers make this mistake. And this just comes down to ourselves as beings, that we have ideas about things, and we like our ideas, and we don't like it when reality proves that we're not quite right. And people don't want to change their perspective. I see people all around me who've come to a comfortable perspective, and when the world doesn't measure up to their ideals, they have a hissy fit. Now you got, say, this Jordan Peterson character is a sort of a lightweight philosopher, and he simply said that. He said, before you try and change the world, because you've seen that so much is wrong with the world, look at yourself and see what's wrong with yourself. He said that to the world and they all want to kill him now. So what's happened in the last 50 or 100 years, that we had a lot of philosophers and a lot of academics who have been making themselves sicker until they've come to a very sick series of philosophies today, which they're parading as the rationales. And it's mad, because no matter what ambition, what aim you have, you need to question yourself and say, well, I might not be the end all of the universe myself. I could be wrong. That's the primary sort of thing, is it? You have your thesis, but you have to have your antithesis and say, at the very least, I could be wrong. But there's a heap of people now, it's just thesis. It's not, I could be wrong. It's how am I going to bludgeon the world with my, bludgeon reality with my thesis.
How can I prove I'm right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the things that you were just talking about is pretty much what the rest of today's about. We'll have a lot of quotes reinforcing what you're saying. And you know, Kenneth, it's very easy if you read much Kenneth to spot him making this same core argument that, you know, if you want to change the world, you can't neglect changing yourself. That we're the instrument through which we're looking at the world and trying to understand it, and that instrument is not a perfect mirror. It's not a perfect lens system, and the imperfections are not small, subtle things. You know, it's an example of it is, you know, why do we have the problem that when we read a text, we interpret it as the opposite? Is it that we're bad readers? You know, that was one of the questions Pensive raised in the chat there, and it's a good one to bring up. And the challenge is that it's because we don't understand the nature of our own reason. We think that reason is directly apprehending reality and making decisions and judgments about it. And we're misunderstanding that reason has no direct access to reality. It's experience that is directly experiencing reality. And then it's sifting. We think reason sifts among the facts and picks the ones that are important. We have that 100% backwards. It's irreason. It's the experiential side of us, the unconscious side of us, that sifts among the experiences and decides which ones are the most juicy, what has the biggest emotional charge. And the juicy ones are brought to the attention of our consciousness. And then our consciousness therefore says, I have chosen these 7 interesting parts of this thing I'm looking at. And it misunderstands that the reason that those 7 parts are interesting to it is that the unconscious already decided that that should be the interesting part. The missing link for rationalists in trying to understand their own reason is failing to understand the way that their attention span itself is a tool not of reason, but of irrationality. It's a tool of experience in which it unconsciously picks and chooses among what has the biggest emotional charge and brings that to the foreground, shoves everything else to the background. So those Hegelians who read Hegel and thought that he was saying that the dialectic is just some sort of rhetoric and there's no actual dialectic in nature, you know, there was no failure in their reason. Their reason did its job. It selected and reasoned among the things that came to their attention from the text. It was their experience, their unconscious side, that chose to suppress the things that didn't have any juice to it. And that included the fact that Hegel couldn't be clearer when he says the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. He couldn't be clearer that he's saying nature itself has the dialectic and the negation of the negation. It is the way that nature develops everything. And he doesn't just say it in one place, he says it in work after work after work. But to someone whose experience doesn't match that, whose unconscious desires doesn't match that, whose ideological preferences doesn't match that, they literally can't pay attention to those sentences in Hegel. They could read it as many times as they want. And they're still going to skim that part and then zero in on some other part and say, "Ooh, look at this part over here." I mean, sure, I'm sure that's important, but ooh, you know, and their eye goes right to the thing that satisfies their ideology and turns away from the thing that doesn't. And they don't know that it's happening to them. They don't even know that that's a natural liability of the human mind. And until you know those things, you can't guard against them. You can't want to stop doing it if you don't know that you're doing it. And again, so that comes back to what's conscious and what's unconscious and what's the division of labor between them and so forth. All of that's kind of built into this Nietzsche idea about sickness and health. Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald, and then we'll come to Pensive.
Well, first let's take up Zeno. There are 4 Zeno's paradoxes that consider the 4 combinations of either quantized space and infinitely divisible space, and the same for time. I mean, the one you cite all the time is the one for infinitely divisible space and time. And that's just being pedantic, but they're pretty tough. If you take all 4 of them, they're a tough nut to think through. And anyone who wants to think about their experience of the world should sort of get the characteristics of space and time clear in their mind. Is it quantized or is it not quantized, or is one quantized and the other not, or are those sort of cross combinations even possible? Almost all my math professors wanted to disprove Zeno in the first day of calculus or something like that, or discrete mathematics, they would do something like that. And most of them not very convincing, actually. The other thing is to go back to your quote from Webb, from Kenneth. One of the things I actually like about his list that makes up the whole whorish business that passes for communication among moderns is that if we avoid it, we want to avoid this gravity sink of perspectivisms. And yet, can I take up an aperspectival, that is a non-perspectival view? Perspectivisms are essential to existentialism. That's the recognition. Existentialism recognizes that that's all we have. We don't ever get the God's eye view of the world or of ourselves or whatever. Rhetoric. Yes, rhetoric, but also we should avoid rhetoric, but we need to be persuaded and to persuade if we are to have civil society. That egocentrism, there's some other, it's like, yes, the Greeks criticized everybody for being an idiot, that is having their own personal egocentric desires, but there's no giving them up, but there's going beyond. You can't say, I don't have my own needs. I don't have my own wants. Popular conformism. Well, should we just not do whatever everybody else is doing? Does that make us more philosophical? Oh, maybe it makes us egocentric. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, this is a great list because, one, all of these are unavoidable, and trying some simple negation of these things to avoid the gravity sink doesn't get us anywhere at all. We're not any more philosophical if we try and do the opposite. You know, so I don't know. This is a marvelous list he put together, and I'm sure he was grinning ear to ear when he did it. You know, because, gosh, this is an attack on modernity and a recognition of reality and a sort of, well, that's the way things are. I mean, you can't avoid perspectivisms. You can try to, what's his word? Always connoisseurial collection of perspectives that reveal more instead of hide more. You can combine rhetoric, elegance, and truth, and try and persuade for right reasons rather than wrong. Egocentrism, you're going to have to know something about what it means to be a human being in order to be able to choose wisely what you want to do. And your first opening to that is yourself. I mean, it's know thyself. Step one, you know, you can't know anybody else until you know yourself. It's your empathy or sympathy or common suffering or whatever that lets you understand other people. And if you can't do this, so I don't know. I've been looking at this list. And just say, well, gee, what do you do? Well, that's what Kenneth says. Well, I'm not here to tell you. I'm here to tell you the dangers in what you're doing and the limitations in what you're doing, and how seeing how other epochs approach these same problems. All epochs have these problems, and see if their choices help you make better choices. Oh, well, enough. But
No, that's the good stuff. I'm so glad you brought it up.
well,
I'm so glad. Yeah, I've been neglecting Zeno's other three paradoxes. I'll
no,
bring
no,
them
I'm
into the
not.
seminar more often. But I mean, what you've got here with this list, it's the way you characterized it that's so important. First of all of these are things that people take for granted as their normal behavior. And so we start by saying you have to understand how dangerous these things are that we all do. But the natural reaction, because we're moderns and, you know, are heirs to medievalism, is to assume that the world is divided into good things and bad things. And if these are bad things, then to be a philosopher, we have to stop doing those things. But of course, what that completely omits is that if we stop doing those things, we can't think at all. I mean, you know, I hear people talk about, they hear about Heraclitus and the sleepwalking and how dangerous it is to be, you know, asleep as you go through life and not examine things. And they think, well, what I want to be is 100% awake. And, you know, that's their counter reaction. Oh, I don't want to be asleep, so I want to be awake. So like, do you understand? You'd be dead, right? You couldn't think at all. If it weren't for the screening process that the unconscious does to reduce an infinite number of inputs to a small number of things that we could reason about, we couldn't reason at all. We'd be constantly being interrupted. You know, it's like someone who can't figure out whether to pay attention to the person they're talking to or to the little motes of light in the dust in the sunbeam, which is important. I don't know. There's things everywhere. I don't know what to look at. This thing that we're afraid of, you know, when we say, well, I don't want to be a sleepwalker, is the prerequisite for thinking. And it's true with all of these, like you said, Donald, all of these things on this list, you can't think without a perspective because we're mortal, we're finite. So we have to have a perspective. That's what it means. We're a tiny point within a large cosmos. We can only see the cosmos from that point. And we're never going to be able to fly to all points in the cosmos and see it from all directions. That's just not a gift we have. We're not ever going to have that gift. You know, and it's the same for the rest of the list. Rhetoric, egocentrism, popular conformism, all of these things have a function to play in us. And so there comes a point where you start to see that to rise philosophically in the way we see the world and think about the world isn't about becoming a superhuman person doing things that nobody's capable of doing. I think, Donald, you summed it up very well when you said it's about, first of all, acknowledging we do these things, acknowledging that they're bad. They may be necessary and good also, but they're also bad, in addition to being, necessary and good. And that the most we can do is to build upon them and try to make something more interesting while recognizing that we're still going to be doing this. There is no outside. There is only growing and developing further. And that's especially for moderns obsessed with the law of the excluded middle, that's a tough nut to swallow. We don't really want to believe that we can't just self-define ourselves and be whatever we want to be. It's like, no, you had Gnothi say out, and why is that the beginning of wisdom? You have to understand your situation to build anything atop that foundation. But what you won't be able to do is rip the foundation out from underneath. It's too late. You're in the middle of the story. You were already born. Your head was already filled with all these assumptions. You're already mortal. It's too late to undo any of those things. You have to go forward.
That's Baron von Munchausen's dilemma. Can I lift myself up by my own pigtails?
Right. And the difference between us and the Baron is he could. We can't. So anyway, Donald, I loved what you said. I know that was marvelous. And of course it goes right to, you said he must have been writing that with a great big grin. And of course, one of his quotes from very early in Otherwise is the Nietzsche quote, "A wisdom full of merry pranks." Oh, it says, I copied it right. It says many, but it should say merry pranks. That you got to be able to laugh, at the human condition. You got to be able to understand that the greatest philosopher is a fool, because foolishness is our natural idiom on which we build all wiser endeavors. And we may not like that. We may not think it's praiseworthy. We may wish we could be something else, but that's the soil in which we grow our gardens. And without that soil, there's no plants. So, this is what we've got to work with. There's got to be a certain amount of laughter. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, there's so many things I could respond to. It's hard to decide, but I'm going to go back to sort of like what Joseph said. I have previously talked about nature is not only singular, like a tree is not only a singular tree, but many other trees. And the ecological cycle is now we're beginning to understand is much more complex than individual things, the one in relationship to the many, to create a kind of symphony of being in a way. And the thing is, like, mankind started out with, I guess, to be an ape, and then evolved, and eventually we became so clever that we developed civilization, but civilization has become ever so much more complex, and it's also developed an ecology of its own. And so Hegel is in touch with that in the sense that he's not talking about anything singular, but just sort of like the movement of this complex ecology that moves through history. And the thing is, there's always been a kind of a problem with the between an idea, a manifestation idea, and its manifestation, because it must filter through all sorts of things. Mediation. And when you were talking about Marx, immediately occurred to me, once again, I'm not enough of an expert, but I know enough between, I guess, Marx to Lenin. But the mediation there was Friedrich Hegel's, who outlived Marx and reinterpreted Marx. So the very disciple of Marx became the denier, like St. Peter's. So in some sense, what you got is not Marx, but Lenin through Hegel, and then through Stalin. So if you take the proletariat, it manages, in a sense, in that sense, the ecology somewhat akin to Hegel, that there's a culture develops and there's an internal struggle, and in order to avoid it falling into violence in a way, you actually have to have a management team of sort. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat. Which means that in this ecology of thinking, one's input is not equal. It's never equal. The dictatorship will have many more votes than any single or even group of the proletariat. The problem is that there are people who manage this system who have self-interest. And hey, it's pretty damn good to be a dictator. I mean, like, so let's keep it going. This is exactly what's happened in China. And so my thought is that, okay, so the manifestation always goes through this period of, how should I say, integration and management. You know, same thing with the Christian church. It became almost the opposite of what it was, because it has something to manage the institution for this exists. And I even thought, okay, if that's true, then what happens is that if you believe in the system, then in some sense, it becomes sort of somewhat invisible. You just believe that that's the way it is. And I begin to wonder, like, if then isn't there something wrong even with Hegel? Because Hegel was working in an environment, and the Geist becomes the Zeitgeist. And the Zeitgeist is also managed. Not every man's Geist has the same vote in the Zeitgeist. And when he wrote, did he notice the invisibility of the bourgeoisie as having more votes than the peasants? I mean, maybe that's why he sort of understood that and say, the hour on Minerva only takes flight at dusk, right? So maybe he noticed that even he is not there, that, you know, is like, he is a sort of a speaking too late in a sense. But the problem with existence is that, in manifestation, is that you can't wait till dusk to act. You're required to take flight at dawn. There's the gap that we all have to manage. And that's the same thing with capital. You know, with capital, we notice capital develop into debt, because you have to have debt to create a kind of exchangeable economy, to be more efficient. And now we know that, particularly when you take it out of the gold standard, not that I'm against that, but by the way, because there's that incredible diversion between money one and money two. And in fact, money two, $1 now is worth, I think, something like 5 cents in 1956. It's the same damn dollar. It's not the same. It's invisible. I mean, so there's always this sort of mediation that takes place in any system, because the system has to be managed in its sort of unfolding in itself, and the mediation creates an invisible sort of difference, so that the people, you know, don't get enough raise to pay for the difference of the inflation. So there you go. I mean, I think there's always a problem between the theory and its manifestation. And I'm not sure we should be totally happy with the owl takes flight at dusk because we're living in the day. Maybe if we were insomniacs, maybe everything worked fine. That's it. So,
Yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, people used to always brag about how little sleep they got. And, you know, the dream was to not sleep at all. And then you could be 100% productive. And of course, that leaves out the fact that in about 3-4 days, you'd be insane, but productive. So I could really, my insanity could be highly effective. I could really change the world with my madness. It's like little details, you know, like prerequisites for rational thought and health we're completely missing from our little recipes for life. Pensive, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, hello. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Okay, so it makes me think of Wittgenstein, how he said that language, it's kind of like a lens, right? You can always zoom in a lot more. You can get more specific, you can get more narrow or more general, like the word right. What do you mean by right? Right? It can mean, you know, turning, it can mean judicial, legislative things that belong to you, like rights, right? Or an affirmation. It can mean so many things. And this is where I think Gadamer really shift my view when he called the project of late modernity the fusing of horizons. Gadamer studied Hegel and Heidegger extensively, and he noticed that a lot of the postmoderns or late moderns, people like Jacques Derrida, were posing this view that because words like right have this infinite amount of meanings that they can take different shades of meaning, and you can always zoom in super narrow or super broad, that we have lost contact with one another. And he's like, no, you're right. There is a level where when we meet someone new, there is a gap there. But communication or rhetoric is a means to bridge that gap. It's a means for me to know you, use my past experiences, my present experiences, and my future experiences of how I conceive of it, to come and combine with you and meet in this fusion of horizons, he would say, so that we can actually be in becoming to be fused to one another and actually understand things that we never understood before. So, and it makes me think, like, if you think of the body, right, like the heart and the brain, two completely different organs, but they come to a point where they mediate each other by sending chemical responses. And they have a mechanism to understand, like, hey, you need to send me more impulses because I'm experiencing adrenaline. So, hey, brain, send me more oxygen, more blood. And the brain, if the brain and the heart can directly speak to each other, that wouldn't be possible. We would there would be no connection. It'll be like just no communication. But because there's chemistry involved, there's oxygen, there's molecules, these fusion of horizons of completely distinct organs can actually function. And so I think that as human beings, I think Gadamer hit something important where he says that the only way that we're going to get over the postmodern condition is to understand that because there is this infinite variability of our own persons, that we cannot connect with each other. That's what Jacques Derrida said, basically, that we're just going through the world without understanding each other, and we're just kind of pranking each other, like Nietzsche, right? Jacques Derrida takes a lot from Nietzsche, and applies, and he says, well, we're just really being jokesters with one another. We really don't understand each other. We're just saying jokes to one another, and we're just kind of going along, but deep within us, we're like, I don't really know what he's saying. And Gadamer's like, no, you're wrong, Derrida. There is an objective world where horizons do fuse and come together. And then to me, that's kind of like the human problem, right? I think at the end of the day, I think eventually there's moments in history where human beings do come and mediate each other and understand one another. And actually come to be like, I didn't understand what you were saying before, and now I actually get to see your point of view. Like, wow, I was so wrong. Like, I prejudged you so bad because I was so stuck in my world. And now that you let me see, I use my open mind, is what Gadamer called have an open mind, thinking that your horizon can just come to an end. He says, no, horizons always keep fusing on. And when people have that mentality, they're like, I never seen it like that. Now I see you in a completely different light. I do believe that. I believe that people at the individual level, at the national level, at the state level, do experience those moments of like, I've definitely misjudged you. That's the human level. And then I heard Phil talk about God. See, that to me, the question is that horizon, right? Especially many traditions have that idea, but within the Christian horizon, it says that gap between God and man is broken. And so, how do you fuse that horizon, right? And that's where the Christian story comes in and says Jesus is the mediator, the mediation, or the cornerstone to be able to fuse that horizon between God and man. And when you come to fuse that relationship with the divine, there is truths that are very uncomfortable to man, like hell, like heaven and hell. Like, men today say, yeah, we cannot know anything absolutely. But then you tell them, do you believe hell exists? And they'll immediately be like, nope, hell does not exist. It cannot be the case. And it's like, but wait a minute, you just told me a while ago that there is no way for you to have absolute knowledge about anything. And now you're saying hell, it's not possible. And so I think that is like one of the debates that are difficult to have in terms of like discussions about the divine, that fusion, that gap that we have between man and the divine, whether there could exist a God so holy that he created human beings, and he created a world in such a way that he sends people to hell and to heaven. And so that's another conversation where that fusion of the gap right there immediately, like, especially in modernity today, it just like, it's like a stopper. And it doesn't let us have that conversation like we do with human beings. It's like, for example, an American politician and a Chinese politician, you immediately, if you tell them like, hey, what do you think about free market capitalism? They'll completely shut that conversation down. As a matter of fact, Google doesn't allow for you to search as freely as we do. Like, it's at that same level of like shutting down that conversation. So I think those two, when I zoom out at those two levels of like fusing the horizon between human beings, it's all about having an open mind, and understanding that we can never have our pure perspective because we come with history. And so we have to find ways, what Gadamer says, to fuse it, to use my own experience to try to understand your experience. If you've been through, let's say, because I grew up in a home where alcoholism was a problem, and somebody grew up with like fentanyl problems, I can use my experience of seeing how alcohol can destroy lives and kind of make connections to someone who grew up with fentanyl problems. And Gadamer says that's my responsibility as a human being, to use my experiences to be able to connect or fuse with one another. And as far as the divine horizon fusion, that's where the debate is at. Like, should one go to the Bible, to the Quran, to the Bhagavad Gita, or to some other more ancient religions to see how are we supposed to use our experiences to merge with the divine? And that's where the debate is at with that. So those are my two thoughts on what Phil was talking about, fusing those two horizons the divine horizon that many of the traditions say that has been broken, and we need a mediator, and the human one where it's like, yeah, you know, modern man says that he's pure, he can see the world completely, but then he's so blind that it doesn't allow for him to fuse to other worldviews. So that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you, Pensive. Yeah, you know, this issue of, you know, if we're gonna make anything larger than a collection of monads, you know, who can't relate to each other because they're all so different and don't understand each other, then we have to learn about each other, learn about, you know, our experiences and our views and so on. But here too, we have the same challenge that we do when trying to learn about the rest of the world of nature, which is this tentative relationship between human reason, the human mind, and the real world, this interpretive framework we use. So the easiest and most natural thing to do when we relate to other people is to be the man with the hammer again and reinterpret them not as who they are, but as who it would be convenient to our mental framework if they were that person. And so we end up reacting to a caricature of the person rather than the actual person themselves. And overcoming that, you're right, it's an intimately related problem to overcoming our inability to deal with, you know, nature and the laws of nature as they actually are, rather than as we want them to be. It's the same fundamental problem we're wrestling with in both cases, is how can we use our experience to get a handle on our own mind's tendency to misrepresent that experience to our conscious mind. You know, so if we can, so I you know, here's another another breadcrumb in the series that I'm kind of putting together today. Kenneth loves to quote this Kierkegaard quote: "A delusion is a state of mind in which one is least able to think of that of which one most needs to think." There's a paradox here, right? Because, you know, when you combine this with Nora Bason's writing on somathesy, where she says that the characteristic of healthy living systems is that they exist, a healthy living organism exists in a perpetual learning relationship with its environment. And it's that ability to sense what's going on in the environment, to learn, to notice the changes, and then to be able to change oneself to respond differently as our circumstances change. That's what makes a living thing more alive than a pebble, say, which must only react passively. You know, the organism contains enough internal complexity that it can reconfigure itself in response to what's going on around it, whether it does it slowly like a plant does, or whether it does it rapidly, you know, like a box jellyfish does. Either way, you know, it's that she says there is this word we need, which is that feedback loop. That's the somathesy, the feedback loop, the constant response and adjustment, and, you know, detection, response, and adjustment. So if you combine these two ideas together, somathesy and delusion, you see that from Nora Bateson's perspective, a delusion is a sickness. It is specifically endangering somathesy. It's endangering our ability to sense what's really going on around us, right? The delusion gives us thought-turning cliches as answers to cut off investigation into what's really happening. Oh, I don't need to think about that further. I already know. It's familiar to me. You know, here too, we get Hegel. What's familiar to us is for that very reason not recognized for what it is. Our brain says, I don't need to ask any further questions because I already know the answers. I'm not going to look any further. I have my caricature of you and who I think you are. So therefore, I don't need to actually talk to you and find out that you're somebody different than I think you are. I can just pretend that you're this caricature person who's convenient for me. Like, you know, I need somebody to scapegoat. I have a caricature of you in which, you know, you're to blame for everything. Why would I want to ask you questions that might reveal that some of the things I blame you for are my own fault? Well, that doesn't, you know, please my ideology. So, you know, I cut off, you know, this is the circular nature of the delusion. By substituting thought-turning cliches for new input, it creates an envelope that cuts us off as it grows more and more from the evidence. And I'm looking at Sharon now. You know, in medicine, you have to be constantly gathering the evidence of what's really going on in the situation, and not merely come with your preconceptions and say, well, I don't need to do any tests. You know, I got an A in that class. I already know how to treat everybody. I don't need to actually learn or watch or investigate. You know, that's a doctor that would not go far in medicine because the somathesy is essential to good medical practice. So delusions, when Kierkegaard talks about delusions, and I should note that Kenneth Smith always generalizes this and says that ideology is a system of delusions. So when we talk about ideological thinking, you know, in a Kenneth Smithian framework, we're building upon this observation by Kierkegaard. When we do this and we put it together with Bateson, we're talking about an illness, which is what takes us back to Nietzsche, right? The sick it has ever made sicker. The more we are in the grip of delusions, the more we are substituting the thought-terminating cliches characteristic of that delusion for actual evidence. The more we're cutting ourselves off from the experience that could teach us that we're wrong, because we've put up an insulating wall of thought-terminating cliches and typical lines of thought that allow us to not have to think something new, that allow us to not have to notice something new, because we look at that something new that could open up a doorway for us to learn more things. And instead of seeing what it is, we see the caricature of it that allows the delusion to protect itself. The thing that doesn't challenge the delusion. That's what we see. And it all happens before the rational mind even gets engaged. You know, the rational mind tries to reason with what the unconscious mind has given it, and it just has a connect the dots puzzle that seems to invariably reinforce the delusion. So this is kind of the next step in the trail of breadcrumbs, because it builds on this Nietzschean concern, which is, you know, how can we use philosophy in a way that could help us to become healthier? And he's saying, well, it's not going to happen by default. It's certainly not going to happen. Now you put them together with Kierkegaard. It's not going to happen as long as we are unable or unwilling to challenge our own delusions, as long as we are unable or unwilling to challenge our own ideologies. Until that happens, all the new evidence in the world just gets reinterpreted and turned back into defenses for our current worldview. And of course, this is why he wrote Millennia Microcosm, to try to give us a way to question our own worldview and break out of that envelope. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
I always wondered whether John of Patmos was just simply crazy. It seems to be it's a common question. And then I started to notice that, well, you know, they claim his work's some sort of prophecy of the world, but I suspect the other party's right that says, no, it's an initiation document. And it's that particular part which I put in the chat, which, you know, then the kings of the earth and the nobles and all that, you know, said, let fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne. And it's a bit like Phil's favourite, A Few Good Men, when he says you can't, Jack Nicholson says you can't handle the truth. And I suspect that's what he was saying there, that humans, if they were to see what King Midas wanted from Silenius, King Midas, you know, tell me the cosmic secrets, tell me the cosmic truth. And Silenius says, why should I tell you what will not profit you? That's what I think this one is about. It's, oh, you thought you could handle the truth. Here's the truth. No, no, no. Bury me. Anything to get me away from the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's so yeah, I threw the Hegel quote into the chat so that we have it captured there too. But I mean, another favorite of Kenneth's, which is closely related to this, is half the work that's done in the world is to make things appear other than they actually are. That's a modern writer, 20th century. And, you know, the idea, well, the first time I read it, I was like, well, that's obviously bullshit. It's like, you know, there's policemen, there's firemen, there's doctors, there's, you know, everybody's doing things that don't have anything to do. I told myself when I first read it, all these people are doing things that have nothing to do with disguising the way reality is. So I disbelieve it. I don't think it's true. But that I wasn't ready to understand it when I first read it, right? I was not ready. I couldn't handle the idea that it's not that there's some official propaganda office of lying that takes up half the US budget. Although we have plenty of official offices of lying, they just don't take up half the budget. Rather, it's that each and every one of us is lying to ourselves all the time. And 7 billion people, that's 7 billion participants in lying. And the lying isn't being done out of malice. It's not being done consciously by people saying, I have decided to lie to myself. Yeah, Beetle. Thank you, David. ER Beetle. It's not that they're consciously trying to deceive anybody. There is this condition that I wasn't ready to consider at the first time I ran into the Beetle quote, which is that it's possible that you can be as candid as you want. You can be fully 100% candid and still lying. There are two different levels of lies. There is the level of lies at which I don't tell you what I actually think and I set out to deceive you. And then there is the level of lying at which I have already deceived myself. And now I candidly share my deceptions with you, 100% believing that they're the truth, even though I was the one that constructed those lies. I was not ready to believe that when I first read Beetle. That's too scary a world. For the younger person that I was when I first read that quote, that is terrifying. The idea that there is that enormous amount of self-deception that's involved in being a human being. And that the self-deception doesn't, again, come out of malice, but it comes out of the need to reduce the complexity of the world to 7 plus or minus 2 things that our rational mind can handle. And in that automatic unconscious reduction is an infinitely sized lie, which is that I have accurately assessed an infinite amount of information and selected the 7 most important things. Because if you make a mistake at that point, it really doesn't matter how good your logic is after that, right? All logic has the Achilles heel that if your premises are bad, it doesn't matter how good your logic is after that, because you can derive falsehoods from bad premises. And the process of generating what we notice, the unconscious process of suppressing most of reality to a small collection of things that we're capable of consciously noticing and then reasoning about, is a process of hiding information, which is deception. And even if it's done with all the goodwill in the world, it cannot help but distort reality. Because reality, it's like trying to put a globe onto a flat map. It doesn't matter how hard you work at it. That sucker is never going to be flat. It's the outer shell of a sphere. It and a flat square map are not the same thing, no matter how you slice it and dice it and pull it and twist it. And it's the same thing when you suppress an infinite reality and reveal the 7 things that are of interest or relevant or important or practical or whatever adjective we want to slip on them that gives us the excuse for thinking about these and not thinking about something else. The deception is built right into the structure of consciousness, and without it, we couldn't think at all. Because we're mortals. We don't have an infinite brain. We only think about a few things at a time. That's the way it works. So this goes back to what Donald was saying. That scary list from Webb's, perspectivisms, rhetoric, egocentrism, popular conformism. I can tell you the very first time I read that sentence, I skimmed over that part. I was not ready to slow down and take them one by one and think about the consequences of each one of them and what it all means, and see why is this the group that's together here. I thought he was just, belaboring, shall I say, right? I thought he was just hammering a point that he could have done with a single word. That there were essentially synonyms, that essentially it meant the gravity sink of bad things. Right? In my brain, I was thinking about judgment and guilt and, am I a smart person or a stupid person? I didn't want to be a stupid person. So I read this as indispensable only to those who see the gravity sink of, stupid ways of thinking. I was not even remotely ready for the idea that he was describing the architecture of the necessary architecture of the human mind and human interpretive frameworks. The idea that this isn't something you get out of, but this is the scary foundation on which we try to build all of our wiser, kinder behaviors. I was totally not ready for that. So anyway, That's why I'm taking the time here with the Hegel and the Kierkegaard and the Synapses to show how this is related to the Nietzsche quote. And once you start to see these connections, and there's more to come in the time we have remaining, but once you start to see these connections, you can see why he felt he had to write this book and what it is that he's hoping to accomplish with it. Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that sounds a whole lot like the Tower of Babel, but I'll skip over that in a way. But it's an important point. I'm trying to tie two very main points together. Maybe three, I don't know. One of the problems, I mean, I love philosophy. To tell you the truth, I love art more. I love philosophy. And the problem I have with philosophy is that many people who pretend they're philosophers are very pretentious because they think they know they're the smartest guy in the room. And it is obvious that there's a gradation in terms of intellects between individuals. I'm not going to deny that fact. But I think human beings have more potential than we give them credit for, if they were only given the opportunity to do so. Okay. So everybody could become at least a low-level philosophers in a sense. And I think what we have is that we have, in a sense, an education system that instead of enlighten people, instead really in many ways dumbify people and sort of channel them into a kind of professional skill. Now, I'm not going to say something bad about professional skills because we certainly need it. But so we're all very, very specialized in what we do. And so it's essentially a kind of like, how would I categorize it? Kind of like junior college. Okay, let's put it that way, right? Instead of wanting to teach you how to be a human being, which is much broader, okay? And I think, which means if you were taught in a humanistic way to be a human being, you would be taught in a broader way of not being quite as localized and be able to have enough diversity to whisk back and forth and criticize various means of whatever it does. And I remember when I was teaching at various different schools, that when I finally ended up at Youngstown State, I was teaching people, you know, because I generally like to teach it in a kind of abstract way and leaving a lot of blank spaces, because that's for them to fill in that, for them to enter into that. I started doing that. I got nowhere. I mean, it was very bad. So I end up actually had to tutor everybody. I mean, that's how I was. And so I know there's already unequal in the system, in a sense. Now I'm going to try to compare that with something else. I remember when I was going to college, one of my high school friends, you know, was finally ended up at the same college as I was. And he was a guardian to his nieces, 3 nieces, because his sister became a drug addict and couldn't care for them. Okay. And now this guy was a little bit of a funny guy in his way. And I remember once he had a conversation with his 3 nieces. They were age 10, 8, and 6. So they were children. And he was telling them something that was obviously untrue. I didn't want to interfere because he was the guardian, you know, and he was directing them. But afterwards, I pulled him aside. I said, "What the hell did you do that for? Because you know what you said was a lie." He said, we live in a world that's so full of for indoctrination that I purposely want to confuse them so they would be forced into, in a sense, evaluate things and begin to develop counter-indoctrination. Okay. And so I told them, like, what the hell are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? Right? I mean, these are children. You can't teach them counter-indoctrination, but they're children, you know? Because children, there's a timeliness and appropriateness to what happened. Why don't you wait till they get to college when they develop a certain thing, you know, they prune out certain development in their brains, and they're able to respond to counter arguments and all that sort of thing, right? So there's an appropriateness of timeliness that is in order to do that, which means you have to be very appropriate in grammar school and secondary school to get them to a level where they could begin to accept a kind of negation. And so that was that. Then I was thinking about, you know, Plato, you know, the way the mind is, you know, the individual have these, I guess, reason, you know, the manager and the chariot, there's a reason and passion, contrasting them. Of course, Plato is all for, you know, letting the horse as reason to take the lead, because passion is always running off, you know, like getting attracted to, you know, beautiful things, you know, ice cream, all sorts of things that we want to get in. That's true. And I kind of disagree with that, at least in part, because I think the two teams have to work together. Because without passion, maybe I shouldn't call it passion, maybe I should say eros. Without eros, there's a gap between theory and its manifestation. And what eros does is to ground things. And as long as you could develop passion, you could have passion off all sorts of things. For instance, a love for learning. That's a love. If you could have that, that opens the channel of connecting reason in terms of understanding and a love for understanding. And I think that we have developed a structure in society in which we misunderstood that. And what we sort of fill people with is a love for things that we could consume. You know, let's go buy the car. Let's go buy this and that. Let's go to the concert, do this and that, right? No wonder nobody has any money left. And when they get sick, they're in a lot of trouble. But what if they had, we direct the coordination to teach this love for something, a love for learning, a love for understanding, because the intuitive mind is also a part of the mind. And I think that we have misunderstood that these horses have to work together. Reason by itself, when a horse is running all over the place, that's not going to work. But if you train the horse in a certain way, then in a sense they work together as a team, because you need both in order to ground the thing in actuality, rather than just distance yourself. Oh yes, things could always work so well, you know, together. I distance myself from being engaged in the world, you know, and all that sort of thing. I think that's part of the problem with a lot of philosophy, is they maybe distance themselves from existence. And existence requires a certain degree of passion or love for the things you want to love. There's no reason why we cannot love learning and love for wisdom, which is what philosophy is supposed to be. That's a love that could be a very deep love, you know. And as much as a love for other things, you know, physical things in the
Yes.
world. So you really need to connect the ideas and the existence in the world for that to be complete. Okay, that's my spiel here, Phil.
It's a good spiel. Thanks, Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
Phil has a good spiel, right? Very good. And I love philosophy, but today I'm not connecting. Where in this passage are we?
So today, I'm not following the text of Millennia and Microcosm. Today, I'm pulling quotes that Kenneth Smith uses in his works to lay a trail of breadcrumbs that leads into the entire book, that we could be used as a foreword for the book.
Okay.
As an introduction to say, why did he write this book? What problem is he trying to solve? So,
Okay.
So I'm about to drop more Kenneth quotes. But yeah, they're not coming from the book. They're more leading into the book.
All right. Thank you.
Good question, Sharon. So the next thing I'm going to share is a quote from the book, which is this one. And I shared this a few weeks before the winter break, before I got bronchitis.
Take it easy on the simple-minded, please.
You anticipated my very next move. I had it all teed up to press return.
Hey, Sharon, first of all, you're not at all simple-minded.
Yeah, you don't fool us with that stuff. You got a good brain on your head. We know it. So you know this. You'll recognize now why I'm quoting this if you combine it with the Nietzsche and the Kierkegaard and the Nora Bateson about synapthy. This is a George Bernard Shaw quote. Except during the 9 months before he draws his first breath, no man manages his affairs as well as a tree does. And then Kenneth says, truly, consciousness in our case must resist the temptation to impose its own extraneous preconceptions of what it needs, which are merely what it thinks it wants. Compared with animals or plants that have their instinctive automatisms and tropisms, humans have a wild card in the deck, a factor of self-determination by an ill-constrained ego and will. The potential for self-chaotizing or self-delusion is incalculably higher because of this distinctively human privilege, which is thus a potential curse, a disease of willful consciousness making man into a sick animal. We've talked about this theme before, right? We've talked about this idea that the gift of a greater intelligence and a greater potential freedom of action is also at exactly the same time a curse, which is an unmooring from a stronger connection to instincts and biological tropisms. Pensiv's talked before about the idea that we could fix a lot of the world's problems if we organize politics according to biology. What do we actually need? And that's a theme related to what Kenneth is criticizing here, which is, you know, a tree doesn't get the idea that maybe it should invent chainsaws and cut down all the other trees. This does not occur to a tree. And it's not just because the tree doesn't have a brain. It also doesn't occur to, you know, wolves, which do have a brain. It doesn't occur to gorillas, which have opposable, you know, thumbs and fingers and all the rest of it. They are more enmeshed in a web of instincts that limits their freedom, but keeps them focused more on doing things that are healthy for themselves or their species. You know, my cat Surya, I don't know if you could hear her off screen from time to time going meow. You know, most days before now, I would have taken her into the basement and given her a treat that she wants. But today I'm here doing this with you, and she knows something's wrong. She's like a little biological clock, and she's like, Papa, you are way off schedule. my tongue and my tummy say you have forgotten something really important. And from her perspective, she's right. It is really important. And, you know, cats are very food motivated because, you know, food is important to their survival. And so is a schedule. They in the wild, part of what makes cats such great predators is that they learn the schedules of their prey. When do they go to the water? When would be a good time to be sitting on a branch in a tree above the water? Jaguars think like this in the Amazon. And, my little kitty here has similar things going on with her. But people are free to yammer on about philosophy. And when we're doing that, we might forget things like, I should probably finish eating my bowl of berries. I get some bites into it and then we're saying something really interesting and I forget that I was even eating. I had this problem at work for decades that, I'd be so into the programming, I'd look up and I'd forgotten to eat breakfast or lunch and it was time to go home. Or rather, it was an hour after time to go home. My wife's wondering where I am. And the answer is, I'm a sick animal. I'll tell you where I am. I'm detached from my needs. I'm connected to my wants instead. And my wants and my needs, they're like this. They're at cross purposes. So, you got to think about, if you put these pieces together, you got to think about what Nietzsche means up in that first quote when he says, the sick it has ever made sicker. Because Nietzsche also says, Nietzsche is the one who says, man is a sick animal, das kranke Tier, that our great powers to do good or evil, we are so used to calling them gifts that we forget that exactly the same time and to at least the same amount, they are also illnesses. Animals who get to know us, who become part of our lives, look at our behavior bewildered at the crazy things we do. And not just because they don't understand. It's not just they don't know what an airplane is or, the man with the hammer, they don't know what the hammer is. It's not just that. It's also that there are parts of life they know really well and they can see us screwing those parts up. Papa, eat your goddamn berries. Papa, give me my treats. You've forgotten the fundamentals of life. in your thinking and talking and blah blah blah. So this is part of what he's talking about here. When Kenneth says, I'm sorry, when Kenneth's putting these quotes together, but when Nietzsche says that the sick it has ever made sicker, and he also says man is a sick animal, I hope that this helps to disrupt the law of the excluded middle. Right? The temptation, like I said at the beginning, is for us to say, the sick it has ever made sicker, and by sick, I mean my opponents. I, of course, am healthy, so philosophy is great for me, but it's those other stupid people who should be staying away from philosophy because they'll just misuse it. This is what a modern wants to do with this quote. If he's going to accept Nietzsche at all, he wants to do self versus other and use the Nietzsche quote to praise himself and to insult the other. But by calling not some of us, but all of us a sick animal, Nietzsche is saying, this is the problem with philosophy. On the one hand, we need to love wisdom, and we need to struggle against the centrifugal forces in us that pull us away from trying to be wiser. But on the other hand, philosophy in our hands is misused at least as often as it's used correctly. We can't treat it like an all good blessing that will bring good things to us, because it's not in the hands of a cat or a wolf or an angel or God. It's in our hands, and we're a sick animal. We're just as likely to hit each other over the head with philosophy as we are to try to cultivate ourselves into being kinder people who communicate with each other. Philosophy is like every other tool we ever pick up. It's both good and bad. It can make things better, but it can make things worse too. And this is what Nietzsche is talking about here. It's too easy for us as moderns who prefer the law of the excluded middle, who prefer simple practical things, to try to carve down his warning into something that loses all of its valuable qualities as a warning and just turn it into self-praise and an insult to other people. Right? Edgy people who adopt Nietzsche because it trolls discussions and stirs other people up, they aren't using Nietzsche's quote correctly. And this is a theme we're going to come back to over and over. And for the last hour of today, we're going to be honing in. This will, for Sharon's benefit, and I think all of ours, we're going to be honing in on the core point of this trail of breadcrumbs, which is that philosophy, whatever else you use it for, you have to use it against yourself. You have to. Philosophy is a response to the admonition, know thyself. It's here however we may use it, God help the world, whatever horrible people we may hammer as though they're nails with it, the valuable part of it, the healthy part of it, is if we can use it as leverage against our own delusions and ideologies, against our own sickness, to try to make ourselves healthier, which is a challenge, as Nietzsche is attempting to lay out for us. And if Kenneth didn't agree with Nietzsche on this point, he wouldn't quote these two quotes all the time the way he does. Joseph, then Pensive. Go ahead, Joseph.
Pensive, go first, because I'm just in the middle of doing something.
Oh,
really.
Sure, I'll come back to you in a moment.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pensive. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, hearing about Nietzsche, I've tried, right? I've tried to read most of what Nietzsche has written, and there's a phase in Nietzsche that there you can kind of see that it bifolds. The beginning, I think, at the day of I forgot the specific title, Dawn of the Daybreak or something like that. You can see that he starts to become a bit more what we would call anti-theistic, and defines his philosophical career onwards from that to writing, the Antichrist. And I posted a link to Copplestone's beautiful analysis of who was Nietzsche, right? What kind of philosopher was he? And the conclusion that he comes to after being, reading everything Nietzsche published and his letters and all of that, he was a philosopher of culture. And Nietzsche seemed to not have a worldview when you read the superficial aspect of him. He spoke about how Plato and Socrates were probably one of the main fathers of mental illness. That's the way that he portrayed it, that this whole idea of escapism, philosophies of escapism, and Christianity was just a manifestation of Platonism. And so he criticizes those worldviews, but then many associate Nietzsche with Nazism, and it's false at first. But if one actually reads what Nietzsche wrote in most of his diaries and his literature, he was from reading him correctly, he was a philosopher of life with the many of the different philosophers that expounded the whole idea of the élan vital, right, the philosophy of life. And when I've actually come to see Nietzsche through Copplestone, that he really, I can see why Nazism really became attracted to him, because there comes a point where Nietzsche was trying to develop a whole worldview around the Übermensch, where all of society was for the sake of these supermen who were to serve and be at the existence of the supermen, because these supermen were able to develop life appropriately, right? And there's certain passages from Nietzsche where he says that there's he literally said there's walking abortions. When we see children in the womb who have mental retardation, we should abort them because they destroy the human stock. Like, he wrote these things, and then he's all about the idea of not perverting the Übermensch, because Copplestone asked the question, where do the Übermensch come if not from the slave class that Nietzsche criticized? And Nietzsche's like, yeah, they do come from there, kind of like a genius just pops out of nowhere. They come from these lower classes, and one cannot expose the Übermensch to have faulty genetics. And that's one of the things about Nietzsche, that it does make him dangerous. When one actually, like, after reading Copplestone, it makes me think, like, yeah, I can see why Nietzsche was dangerous, because he did have this genetic supremacy that was mixed with Darwinism. in the 20th century. And I can see why Hitler and the Nazi Party, when they read certain essays and certain ideas of how the slave class exists for the Übermensch, and it's basically the feeding ground for the Übermensch. I can see why it was attractive to a fascist government that believed that the ultimate goal was to create the ultimate Aryan, and everyone else was just the feeding stock for this entity. And so Nietzsche, in that sense, he is, after reading Copplestone, he is dangerous. One can say that, okay, he does have dangerous ideas, because he did try to, he was trying to develop a unified philosophy where the Übermensch was at the top, and the will to power was kind of like the assimilation of what led to the creation of this entity, where abortion of disabled people had to be a possibility in the Nietzschean world, where inferior people were to be considered second-class citizens, and the Übermensch was to be considered the ultimate primary citizen. So when you really look at Nietzsche and try to apply it and read all of the canon of Nietzsche, one really does have to say, like, okay, Nietzsche does have some ideas in terms of culture. He does criticize. I think he's the best critic of Christianity that Christianity has to have, because he just points at the hypocrisies, the same ideas that Kierkegaard had about how dead religion produces hypocrites, and a religion that is not relevant to its day, in the sense of, like, be real, right? Be authentic. Have an authentic religion. Don't just try to fit in to please the politics of the day, but stand for your principles. Like that is what gives life to religion. And Nietzsche was looking at the Roman Catholic Church of his days, the Protestant Church of his days, that they were just trying to please the state, and they were pretty much dead already by the time that he was writing. So in that sense, yeah, Nietzsche's right on the money. There's many quotes that criticize dead philosophy, pure rationalism, pure empiricism. But once one starts to see where Nietzsche's going, Nietzsche's trying to develop a whole worldview around the Übermensch, and it's pretty grim, you know. I'm like, and I recommend reading Copplestone and seeing that Nietzsche, that step right there, that step that he calls one to do, leads to worlds of Nazism as a possibility. So there he is, in that sense, someone to kind of like you were saying, like someone to troll people with, because it's like, you quote one aphorism from Nietzsche, and it's like, whoa, like I can feel the danger there, because he kind of is, that we're hearing about Nietzsche.
Yeah. So, the thing about Nietzsche is that the later works were his sister cutting up his diary entries and turning them into works. And he never intended those things to be published. Right.
So, the will to, from what I recall, it was the diaries was the will to power.
That's right.
From the sources of the Übermensch.
Yeah.
For example, the gay science.
That's material that he didn't think reflected his philosophy.
Are you referring to like the documents written in the gay science?
Like no, like the will to power, not the gay.
No,
science.
I'm referring to passages in the gay science.
Right. So the thing about the Übermensch that's critical to understand is, if we go back to this quote about the sick animal, Nietzsche doesn't say most people are sick animals. He doesn't say weak people are sick animals. He says man is a sick animal. That is, and this is the point that the Nazis misunderstood on purpose, because they wanted to.
No, I understand in terms of the will to
if I could finish. What he's saying is there are no Übermensches to be found in our species. Anybody in our species who claims to be an Übermensch is just another example of a sick animal. Because among our sicknesses is the belief that, if we call ourselves king, then we're king. If we call ourselves God, then we're God. If we call ourselves Christian, then we're Christian. That there is this belief that we can self-define ourselves as something other than what we actually are. And this is a different thing from actually doing the work to strive to become better. This is just like when somebody claims to be better. So the Übermensch idea is not based on the idea that some of us should rule over others of us. The Übermensch idea is to underscore the limitations of Homo sapiens by describing what something better than Homo sapiens would be like. When he says man is a problem that must be overcome, he's not talking about death squads and, you know, aborting people who have, you know, Down syndrome. He's not talking about any of that stuff. He's saying that our species has problems built right into the way that it sees the world, and that, you know, the proper conduct of life requires us to be cautious about those problems in our psychology. And among the proof that we have that problem is that people will come along and say, oh, Übermensch, I must be the Übermensch that you meant. Oh, glorious me. And furthermore, Nietzsche loves me because Nietzsche talked about the Übermensch. It's like, no, Nietzsche wasn't talking about you, buddy. When he was talking about the sick animal, he was talking about you. Are you Homo sapiens? Well, then you're the sick animal. This is the animal that he's concerned about. So there's this thing that people like Copplestone and others do, where they read Nietzsche, they read the way that the Nazis used Nietzsche, and they conclude that that must be what Nietzsche had in mind, that he was trying to set that in motion.
Well, the thing. Well, I would beg to differ there, because Copplestone acknowledges that the sister did have a part in the will to power. He does recognize that.
Yeah.
But as far as, did Nietzsche actually give an example of who he considered to be Übermensch? Yes, Napoleon. He considered Napoleon to be an example of an Übermensch.
At first.
And so the question is, when he considered good and evil, when he wrote Beyond Good and Evil, he expounded a theory that to kill could be good, depending on how the Übermensch saw fit to push the human species forward. Now, does Nietzsche believe that there's Übermensch sprouting everywhere? No, he believes that they're rare. And so I think I would defer in the sense that he makes it an ideal that's not possible. That kind of would contradict his idea of Plato, because he disliked this idea that ideals existed. He embraced, I think Nietzsche is respectable in the sense that he embraced, I shouldn't say respectable, but he embraced the idea that Übermensch were not going to be perfect, and that they actually define morality according to their needs of the time. So is it okay to kill? Maybe, Nietzsche would say, sometimes. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's not. Is there such thing as a perfect Übermensch? No.
So
define perfection.
We could spend an entire arc of philosophy seminars talking about Nietzsche and exactly what he said and didn't say. The most critical thing to understand about Nietzsche is that he didn't agree with himself. That the things that he wrote early on, or the things that he wrote in the middle, or the things that he wrote late in his career, are very different from each other. He's like on this big journey in which his later writings contradict his earlier writings. And
I would agree. He's on a trajectory to build the metaphysics.
Anybody can pick up Nietzsche and just pick some moment in Nietzsche and say, look, he says this thing. This must be Nietzsche's philosophy. But the issue here is that Nietzsche doesn't have a philosophy. He's a philosopher. And that means he's on a journey. And that means anything he says early on, he's free to refute later on, which he does repeatedly. I mean, one of his earliest works is talking about how glorious Wagner is. But it's not that many books later before he says, I was wrong, Wagner's a total turd.
And he calls him, he actually distanced himself because of his Nazism. And his music became ideological and dead.
Yes.
Right? That's one of the main reasons.
Yes. So here's an example of him initially praising somebody who you might think, oh, look, he's saying that it's possible for somebody to be an Übermensch. And then later on, he's going, I was totally wrong about that. This guy's a dick. And when you read what are the recurring themes that survive across the entire arc of his writing, one of them is how much he detests German nationalism.
Yes.
Hates it. Yes. Hates it so bad from the beginning of his writings to the end of his writings. So the idea that Nietzsche would ever embrace what the Nazis did.
Oh, I wouldn't say the embrace. I would say that if one follows Nietzsche, I'm far away from saying that he would approve of. If one follows Nietzsche's philosophy of culture, one would arrive at worldviews that have people who are inferior and some are superior. Like that's like the blueprint. Now the question is, can you adopt it to fit Procrusteanly to your worldview, like Nazism? Oh yeah, that's an example. Would be his sister, right? He had quotes that
exactly
kind of
right.
jive, but in essence, I think what Copleston pointed out is that the culture that he was, the philosophy of culture that he was proposing, lend itself to worldviews where biological supermen were to be encouraged to exist. And I think probably that's one of the main background stories of like the Brave New World, right? That's kind of very Nietzschean.
So Pensive, we've got a few more things to get through today on this, not on Nietzsche, but on this topic of an introduction to the Millennia and Microcosm book. What we could do is we could see if David could schedule for us another session, another time, in which we could talk specifically about Nietzsche and Copleston.
Oh yeah, that would be
because
awesome.
then we could have 3 hours to get into it, and it wouldn't be trying to cram it in at the end of.
Right.
Because it's as you say, it's a complex topic, and I certainly agree with you 100% that Nietzsche is a classic example of a philosopher whose philosophy is dangerous. But Nietzsche's argument is not just that his philosophy is dangerous, but that all philosophy is dangerous. And it's dangerous because it's in the hands of Homo sapiens.
Right. That's kind of the irony. Yeah, that's the play. The playing goes there. The musical kind of like the jazzing of it. Yeah, and Nietzsche was a musician too.
Yeah, that's right. So we can come back to exactly where Nietzsche stands on some of these issues in a separate thing in which we talk, in which we could all have a reading assignment to read the Copleston book and then come back and look at it. But generally speaking, for today's purposes, the things that I'm quoting are not part of anything that could be directly misconstrued as genocide. This is the stuff that's talking about the fact that philosophy, and this is the core problem, human reason and philosophy have problems that rationalists, and now I'm going to sing Stephen's song, that rationalists don't like to admit to. And that is that our reason doesn't work in some perfect divine Ubermensch way. It works in these flawed ways that are intrinsic to the way that the human animal is structured. And those flaws, as much as we might prefer not to think about them or talk about them, they are in fact the elephant in the room. Anytime we want to engage in philosophy, anytime we want to engage in reason, we have to do it with sort of, you think about all those medieval writers who put a skull on the desk in front of them as the memento mori to remind them to not forget about their own mortality and their limitations. Effectively, what Nietzsche's doing here and what Kenneth recommends is that we, as a kind of memento mori, keep this idea of the sick animal in front of us whenever we're engaging in intellectual discourse, philosophizing. Anytime we get too confident about ourselves and our opinions, it's an excellent time to bring out the memento mori and say, yeah, but we're mortal. And as mortals, our thinking is defective. We're gonna try to put in place safety nets and checks on the system, like science tries to do. Like, again, I'm looking at Sharon and thinking about medicine. We're gonna try to surround ourselves with systems that help give reality a fighting chance to bust through our ideologies and show us what's actually going on. And we may use other techniques as well, but the point is that there need to be some techniques, some orientation and focus. If we can only think about 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time, one of those things should always be beware, oh sick animal, from being way too sure of yourself as you draw these conclusions, right? Because no matter how smart it sounds to you, no matter how appreciative your audience is, you're a sick animal, and your methods of reasoning are inherently flawed and need to be taken with a grain of salt. So that was all. I wasn't really trying to endorse everything Nietzsche ever said or what have you, but I think from the perspective here, we need to address this bit. Now, Donald quoted earlier from Kenneth a quote that Kenneth quotes all the time, but it comes from Kafka. It says, Kenneth says that modernity is digging the pit of Babel. We are digging the pit of Babel is a Kafka quote. And Kafka is part of this tradition. He may be a writer and a poet rather than a philosopher, end quote. But Kenneth takes his existential insights wherever he can find them. And Kafka has a gift for boiling down really difficult to explain features of modernity in ways that are unforgettable, like in the Metamorphosis. I mean, huge numbers of people at least know the idea of the story of the Metamorphosis, even if they've never read it. You know, it sticks in the brain. God, he woke up one day and he was a cockroach. It's like, it's hard to forget this as a premise for a story. And the digging the pit of Babel, you know, the burrow, right? Der Bau, I think it is. The story written from the perspective of a mole whose entire world is about paranoia. And the paranoia is that the whole world cares about nothing so much as it cares about getting into his burrow and stealing his stocks of food. And he's just sure that's all anybody thinks about. So that's all he thinks about. He's constantly redigging his tunnels and putting up blockages and camouflage. And all he can think about is how to fool all those people out in the world who he's sure are obsessed with his little roots and things that he's got socked away in his tunnels. And of course, the whole thing is a metaphor for the way we're basically idiots, right? We are preoccupied with our own things, and we assume that the center of our world is also the center of everybody else's world. So Kafka, there is a. I'm gonna call on Stephen in just a moment. There is an item, another quote here, and I found it. Here it is. Let me just drop it into the chat. This is from Otherwise. It's from the parable Anti-World, Anti-Soul, Anti-Mind, Anti-Will. And it ends with this quote from Kafka, which I never really understood until recently, I think. He was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint only on the condition he use it against himself. So the trick is to know Archimedes, right? Inventor of, you know, he was a Alexandrian engineer. He invented many things like the screw pump, and he wrote treatises on simple machines like the lever, showing why they worked and how they operated, and how it was like a magic trick built into the universe, that with a long enough lever with the right fulcrum, you could move anything, even if it was much heavier than you were. You just had to arrange, you know, the right lever in the right place with the right fulcrum. And even a small amount of strength would be multiplied by the geometry of the lever and lift something that you yourself could never have lifted if you tried to pick it up yourself. And Archimedes made many wonderful devices and machines illustrating these points, and sort of was the wonder of his age. In this, I'm going to concede something to Stephen that I'm going to concede even more thoroughly as the rest of today goes on, which is, I've been saying for years that the Greeks didn't have any science at all and the Arabs invented it. And Stephen said, I'm not sure you're right about that. He says, maybe science had been invented before and the Arabs just rediscovered it. And I said, no, that can't be right. But I found some books. I think Stephen might be right. In the early Greeks of the classical era didn't have science. But it looks like the later periods, like the Alexandrian periods and some of the late Roman Empire, there were philosophers, Greek and Roman philosophers, who basically were describing in writing the scientific method, and whose whole lives were about engineering and so forth, where if you don't have the scientific method, you're not going to be able to pull off all those great works. So I want to concede that Stephen was right about this. Thank you, Stephen. The whole reason I went looking for it was because Stephen said I was wrong. It may have taken a year or more before I fully got there, but I didn't forget what you said, Stephen. So Archimedes is one of those guys who's discovering principles of physics through experimentation. And the Archimedean standpoint was based on a famous brag he meant that he gave once. And the brag goes like this: simple machines are ways of illustrating the logos, right? What are the laws of the universe? And those laws are as binding as any law we can imagine a human being imposing on one another. In fact, they're more binding. They apply to everybody, no matter what, whether they like them or not. And he said, he gave all these demonstrations of moving things of incredible mass by himself with a lever, just to show, you know, this is obviously impossible, but I'm doing it. And that's because the laws of nature can't be fooled. They work the way they work. And if you learn them and work with them, then they can do incredible things that you could never do by yourself. And the brag was, I am so sure about the properties of a lever and how it works that I can say with confidence that if I could find the right, a long enough lever, strong enough, long enough lever, and the right fulcrum, that somewhere in the cosmos there would be a point far enough away from the Earth that if I stood there and I pushed on the lever, I could move the entire world. This is Archimedes, right? And it would be true if the Earth weren't swirling around, in a huge ballistic flight around the sun, and the sun weren't moving through the cosmos. He didn't know those things, right? But if he were right that it was basically a static cosmos, then yeah, of course, there's no reason why you couldn't, with the right kind of lever, move the whole world. It doesn't matter how heavy something is. It could be heavier than you could even imagine, and still there would be some way to do this. So the trick here, the reason why Kenneth cites this quote over and over and over, is to use the Archimedean standpoint metaphorically, which is, how do we overcome the problem in which our own worldviews are so full of ideologies and delusions that it becomes like a labyrinth we can't get out of? So there's not, earlier in this talk, we've been talking about the difficulty of trying to penetrate our thick skulls. How do you get past someone's defenses to expose them to reality so that they can learn from it? How can that be made to happen? And part of what medical school does is not just teach the receptive how to attune themselves to the evidence. It also winnows out the people who just can't be taught, who are too sure of themselves. They simply won't pay attention to the evidence, and there's no way in. Those people, to the extent that medical school works, are winnowed out. And the ones who get through are the ones who are at least receptive to the possibility of opening themselves up to the evidence and letting it teach them. So Kenneth has this metaphor. He says, if you can imagine the difficulty of cracking through the shell of defenses to let a little bit of light in, if you use the metaphor of mass, then you can imagine that there's some philosophical equivalent of the Archimedean standpoint, where if you could stand there and you had the right lever and you could push on it just so, you could upend somebody's worldview long enough to make them look at the world. You could show them something missing and inexplicable within the framework of their worldview. And in that moment of temporary shock, there'd be an opportunity for real things to appear in front of them, which had been filtered out until now by their watertight ideologies. So the Archimedean standpoint here, he uses this powerful brag of Archimedes as a metaphor for, wouldn't it be nice if for each person it were easier to locate the Archimedean standpoint that would allow us to lever up all those shields and defenses and give them an opportunity to see the world as it actually is, to get through that, right? To crack that problem. We're going to come back to this in a moment, but first I'm going to call on Stephen. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, I can't remember what Joseph was saying something a few days ago along those lines. I can't remember that one exactly. I think my argument has been that people think that the Greeks are the geniuses, and I'm claiming that what the Greeks were working on was coming from the Middle East. A lot of the inventions were coming from the Middle East. What the Greeks seem to have done was discuss it quite a lot. It seems, if you came up with a good idea in the Middle East, make sure you hide it from everybody else. You don't want them knowing your secrets. Seem to be the method in the Middle East. For example, there's some claim that the Phoenicians created a colony in Greece, and that's what brought Greece out of the geometric dark age. So we've got this idea that it's somehow, the Greeks suddenly, we come up suddenly with all the ideas, and I think it was in other people, but for some reason, the Greek political process allowed people to have ideas and discuss them for quite a while before they poisoned them. It took Socrates years before they finally decided to get rid of him, but maybe in the Middle East they're just a lot quicker. But there was a great deal of invention going on in the Greco-Roman period, and it seems to be that when the Roman Empire was created, or when empires are created, rulers of these empires suddenly discover that new ideas are a very risky proposition. And you start to see them closing down. For example, the Greeks make the Great Library. And after a few generations, suddenly the rulers are noticing that the Great Library is a dangerous source of ideas which are risky for me. Better reduce the library a little bit. And this seems to have been the entire process. The Roman Empire became very oriental, if you like me to use that term. It became what it was criticising the Persians for being. It became just like the Persians. Yeah, I was going to say about Nietzsche, and this is my point. I was reading Rudolf Steiner's book on Nietzsche, and Steiner didn't agree with Nietzsche's conclusions. But what he said about Nietzsche was this, that virtually he was a canary in the coal mine. Nietzsche was a man of tremendous sensitivity, and he was noticing things that other people weren't noticing. And what's important about Nietzsche is his questions, because he's just picking up on stuff that was bypassing other people. His conclusions, Steiner thought, not so great. But yeah, you cannot ignore Nietzsche for the sake of his questions, for the sake of his tremendous sensitivity of mind. I mean, Steiner brought up the example of Wagner, that in a certain sense, Nietzsche was a little bit dishonest. He's praising Wagner to the 11th heaven when it's quite obvious that he was probably irritated by Wagner very early in the piece, and only when the final break comes does he bring out all his criticisms. And that's not exactly honest, is it? But yeah,
like you've been saving them up.
The canary in the coal mine, comes to the crowd and says, well, God is dead. And the crowd says, yeah, so what? The madman's sort of thinking, well, this religion that you had for 2,000 years, which is the basis of so much of your culture, it's the basis of your moral propositions, and you don't care that it's died, like it doesn't matter. You're standing there like you're fools on the Titanic, your boat's about to sink. They don't notice. It's a question. They're ignoring the questions. They think, well, we're sitting pretty. Are you? Really? Just before World War I and World War II, they all thought we're sitting pretty. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's because he wrote on so many things at so many different points in his life and on his journey. Nietzsche ends up being like a Rorschach test sometimes, where people can read into him whatever they like or whatever irritates them, whatever they're afraid of. You can find a Nietzsche quote somewhere that supports it, because he was not in a single place. He moved, and movement can be very confusing to people who are assuming that other people stand still and have a single system of ideas. Yeah, and I'll come back over and over in the weeks ahead to what you just talked about, Stephen. This issue about the Greeks and their relationship to science. It's been a big epiphany for me, and eventually I'll share some titles. But for this week, it's mainly just to explain who Archimedes is. So why do I think this I got to say, when I first read the Archimedes quote, my first reaction again was that I didn't like it. You know, when I first read Kafka, it was when I was a kid, and my grandma Anne, who had this collection of books, who had great hopes for me. I think I disappointed her a lot at the time because I was a very conservative kid by comparison with, she wanted me to broaden my mind and be more cosmopolitan. She gave me the Metamorphosis to read. And right off the bat, I didn't like it at all. You know, it's like, the way he turns into a cockroach for no reason, and all these people are behaving in such strange, I don't like any of this. This doesn't feel good. And what she was missing was she was trying to get me to understand that, you know, the illness is not in Kafka, the illness is in society, and Kafka's painting a picture of it for us. But I was afraid of the idea that there was an illness like that in society. So I was inclined to blame him. You know, you shoot the messenger, right? I was inclined to think it was Kafka's fault, not society's fault. And, you know, why would anyone read this stuff? It's sick. I used the word. I don't know what I was, 11, 12? I called it sick. And of course, in doing so, I was just projecting society's sickness onto the guy who was warning us the society was sick. Years later, I feel very differently about Kafka, but I was not ready for that message at that time. So the first time that I saw Kenneth quoting this Kafka quote, he was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint only on the condition to use it against himself. I did not like it. I'd still not come around to being willing to fully come to grips with kind of the problems in our society. So, you know, I was like, oh God, it's Kafka again. Of course he says that. He's such a downer. You know, he's just the whole point of this is that he's playing with us and being fatalistic and depressing. So I always thought that he was saying that it was a bad thing. This is my epiphany for today. This is my epiphany for today. And it'll take the remaining 19 minutes to fully get there. I always thought this quote was saying that it's a bad thing that he was forced to use the Archimedean standpoint against himself. I mean, the sentence reads like it's a bad thing. You know, and of course, if you're thinking about it in terms of the brag of Archimedes, he wants to change the world, but he needs this standpoint, but they'll only give it to him on the condition to use it against himself. Well, again, it sounds cruel, right? Like the gods or the fates or the author is messing with you, just trying to withhold the thing that you need. And, you know, I had enough of that in my life. I wasn't willing to play Kafka's game. I was like, no, you're just being a downer. But what I've come to understand is that using the Archimedean standpoint against yourself is like Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill. It's somebody who's not an Aristos who thinks that that's a punishment. Rolling the boulder up the hill is the lifelong work to overcome your problems, the defects in your understanding of the world, to try to be a better person. And why would you ever want to stop and say, the current collection of horrible defects that are in my character, why don't I just keep those and act them out and inflict them upon the world and not try to be any better? Why wouldn't I want to keep striving to do better tomorrow than I did yesterday? Right? The pushing the boulder up the hill is a classic example of something that separates the Aristoi from other people. And of course, we're not talking about Übermensches here. Aristoi is not an Übermensch. We're just talking about those who want to strive to do better versus those who want life to be easy. There is this, I've mentioned it before, but it comes up right here. There is this Kierkegaard quote. He looks around the world and sees all these people who are working in their glorious age to make things easier for everyone. And he asks himself, Kierkegaard asks himself, how can I contribute? How can I help in this bold new age? And he thinks to himself, I know, instead of making everything easier, how about if I set out to make everything harder? And it brings me back to what Phil said earlier about the teacher working to subvert the expectations of the children and get them to start questioning. It's easy to go along with orthodoxy. It's easy to submit to ideology and delusion and thought to remain cliches. That's what they're designed for, is to be the easy path downward instead of the long, difficult climb up into the light. But the long, difficult climb is what gets you up into the light, right? I mean, and you know, we should want to do that. We should want to struggle. So this Kafka quote I started reading today in preparation for this class with that in mind. What if he's saying the opposite? What if using the Archimedean standpoint against yourself isn't a bad thing, What if it's not a punishment? What if people just think it's a punishment because they're not Aristoi? If you were an Aristos, maybe you would want an Archimedean standpoint that you could use against yourself, because as Nietzsche says, man is a problem that must be overcome. We are a sick animal. We have an illness that we have to struggle against, and an aid in that struggle would be most welcome. So now I'm going to take us back to Heraclitus, which is where I think it all comes together. This first quote, I mean, I shared my epiphany about this quote with you guys about a year and a half ago. Although this logos, and by logos, he's talking about the laws of nature, what is the intelligence of the cosmos that makes it behave in a coherent fashion, that makes it a cosmos instead of a chaos. Although this logos is eternally valid, yet men are unable to understand it, not only before hearing it, but even after they've heard it for the first time. That is to say, although all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, by which he means the evidence of the logos is literally everywhere. You can't look at anything without seeing the fingerprints of the logos in action. Men seem to be quite without any experience of it, at least if they're judged in the light of such words and deeds as I am here setting forth. My own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature. And when we talked about this a year and a half ago, we talked about the fact that by nature, we're talking about character, right? My nature is my character. Human nature is the character of Homo sapiens. And the natural world has its character, which is the logos. That is the character of nature. So when he says he's distinguishing each thing according to its nature, he's saying that he's distinguishing each thing according to its character, the character that generates that nature, that makes it behave the way that it does. And then and to specify how it behaves. And then he says the thing that I admitted a year and a half ago, that after 20 years of reading Heraclitus, it had only occurred to me for the first time that I'd skimmed the second half of the sentence. And I had that epiphany a year and a half ago where I said, I've been misreading. The whole point of this fragment is the part I've been skimming. I got it exactly backwards the whole time. He says, other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. And I thought, oh, some people are sleepwalkers and some people are awake. And we shouldn't want to be sleepwalkers. We should want to be awake. That was how I read that second clause. And it's because I was missing when he said, as heedless in their as heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them. And what is around them? The world of nature is around them, the external nature that he is defining the logos. He's trying to explicate the logos to help us understand its character. And if that's true, the reason he's putting this sentence together the way he is to say, and within them, because people have a second nature. And it's the nature within them. He's got other quotes elsewhere where he says you couldn't plumb the limits of the soul even if you spent your whole life doing nothing else. So great is its profundity, that there is an infinity inside of us, just like there is an infinity around us. And it's not a chaos, it's a cosmos. We are amphibians inhabiting two cosmoi, the external cosmos of nature and the internal cosmos of our own nature. And these two infinities, are issues with being awake or asleep. The struggle comes from our inability to distinguish when we're responding to what's outside of us versus when we're responding to what's inside of us. He has this second quote. It's the very second. This is the first fragment I shared. The very second fragment that in Wheelwright's translation is this. And you really can see it as the partner to this fragment. We should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all. Now, this theme of what is common to all, the logos as a shared intelligence, he uses these phrases over and over and over in his fragments, that it can be a guide for us because we share the world of nature, the cosmos, in common. We all live in the same universe. It has the same underlying intelligence, and that intelligence could guide us if we would study it and listen to it. He says, yet although the logos is common to all, and therefore should be what guides us, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. That is, his own character, his own ideas and opinions, his delusions, his ideologies, his thought-turning cliches, all the things Kierkegaard is later talking about, all the things that Nietzsche is later talking about, Shaw, all that Kenneth Smith is talking about. This problem is that we're standing between two worlds and we're ignoring the intelligence out here that we should be following, and we're overly focusing on our crazy ideas in our head. And as sick animals, a lot of the ideas are really, truly crazy. But we still think that the fact that it's coming from inside of us makes it more true than what's outside of us. This idea that there's a cosmos inside of us like a cosmos outside of us is the metaphor for the Greeks was the world. The world is a cosmos. And so it's like you've got a world inside of you. And the problem is, how do you crack the shell of all the defenses that cut you off from seeing past that shell to the intelligence outside of us? How can you get through that? And the way you get through it is with a long enough lever and the right fulcrum and an Archimedean standpoint. This is why Kenneth keeps quoting this Kafka quote about the Archimedean standpoint. Just like the Aristos wants to push the boulder up the hill, he wants to find a way past this mass of delusions that he has. Not other people's delusions. The point isn't to see how smart he is by tearing down other people and saying, haha, you're wrong. Says that's a child's game. The intelligent thing, the important thing, the wise thing is gnothi seauton, to go after your own delusions, your own ideologies, because they're blocking you from seeing the world. They're blocking, as Pensive was saying, they're blocking you from connecting to other people and being able to create that, that threshold boundary where we can actually get to know each other. All of that's stopped by this shell that's in the way. And if only we had a long enough lever and an Archimedean standpoint to move that thing out of our way and look past it. So the entire premise of this book is to try to be able to learn to take off this great weight that we're so accustomed to, that we don't even recognize as a weight anymore, that we think it's just the way things are, that we think we're seeing the world the way that it is. We take it for granted. And how can we lever that off of ourselves and learn to slip into other worldviews and see the world from their perspective, so that for the first time in our lives, we can realize how much of what we think is obvious is actually just a trick of perspective from standing within the shell that we were standing within. And that if we were standing in another shell, the world looks so incredibly different. Blow our minds and get us to stop taking for granted that the modern way of looking at things must be the right one. Anyway, I wanted to run us through that. Stephen, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'll probably say that it was in my teenage years that I had one of the turning points of my life. And that was, well, I wonder about the education system and the whole effect that monism has had on the modern world. And this is the problem. All right, as a kid, you're pushed to try and be right all the time. You're in school, you have to be right. And if you discover a thing you should be doing, then you must perfect it. You have to do it. But there's a problem with that one, that the minds can decide, I don't want to get up out of bed. I don't want to hear the message that getting up early in the morning is the better way to do things. So I'll shoot the messenger. There's a voice coming along and said, getting up early in the morning's the smart thing. I like sleeping in. I will shoot the messenger. But no, that's the dumb way. It's better to let the message be there and contemplate it. And look, if you want to sleep in all day, fine, but do not. The worst thing you can ever do is shoot the messenger. And our society is full of shooting the messenger. Every time you argue with people, they can't contain themselves. They won't hear you out. They're jumping, no, you're wrong. Oh, just listen to me. And yes, I could be wrong. Fair enough. I shocked my friends in the Rationalist Humanist Club, because I see them running on something philosophers have talked about, and that is, we're searching for good, and when we find a new good, we're going to take it into ourselves and be the new good. And the warning from philosophers is, when you do that, you're a moral automation, that your whole idea of good and evil is to be automatically good. But as some have pointed out, that is not a moral creature. A truly moral creature chooses between good and evil.
Mhm.
Is a creature that is automatically good really good? Or
Right.
is he just a machine?
Right.
They don't think about that one. But yeah, that's my warning. Don't shoot the messenger. You can put him on the shelf. You know, put it on the bed next to you, leave the sign there, and occasionally you can choose not to contemplate it, but don't burn the letter, whatever you do.
I'm with
Thank
you. I mean, that was me as a kid looking at Kafka and going, "Dad, he's sick. It must be his fault that I feel this way." And of course, even at age 11, you've had enough exposure to the craziness of modern society that not everything is okay. I mean, especially if you grew up in a wildly dysfunctional family like I did. But I mean, even in the most functional family, if you're well adapted to, this crazy way of life we have, there's plenty of evidence all around that not all is right with the world, that there's a sickness. But that's too scary. So it's easier to just accuse Kafka of being sick, or accuse Nietzsche of being sick, or what have you. You see this with the way that people will try to explain the craziness in his writing, Nietzsche's writing, by pointing to the way he later went mad and say, well, he must have been going mad all along. And so really we don't have to take him seriously. These are the products of a degenerating mind. But, the medical assessment is that that's not true at all. He had a congenital condition he inherited from his dad, who went through the same thing, which is you're fine until you have an attack, and then you're not fine, and you're stuck that way. And that was what happened to his dad, and that was what happened to Nietzsche. But if you don't want to listen, if you want to shoot the messenger, you can always find a way to do it. There's plenty of excuses. We're very clever with our hammers. Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this is going to be a kind of a difficult thing to explain. It's a personal thing in a way. I'm going to begin by starting with when I was at Berkeley, I had to take a language, and I was very bad at languages. So I thought, well, maybe I could skirt around this by taking Chinese. Well, first of all, I've forgotten all my Chinese. But the Chinese that are being taught at school was Mandarin, which is completely different from my original language, which is Cantonese, So that wasn't helpful at all. It was like very, very difficult. And I remember the person that was teaching, I actually liked this guy quite a lot. He was, I don't know whether it's an adjunct or whether it was a graduate assistant or whatever, but he was Taiwanese. And he didn't quite get his English correctly. And so he was smart though. So he tried to explain the different categories of statements you could make: declaratory, exclamatory, interrogative. But when he came to interrogative, he says interrogative. And I said, I thought about it. Maybe he's right. Okay, so that's a background I want to set. Well, when I was going to school, I was learning art, and in some ways it manifested being very, very different from what I originally thought art was in high school. But I was learning it. I was absorbing all that stuff. This partly had to do with the fact that, one lives in a certain structure of understanding, one is on the one hand dependent on it, and yet on the other hand also, in a sense, understand that you got to go beyond it in some sense. So I was going along fine, everything was going good. And then one day I started painting these, what appeared to me was very ugly pictures. And I wonder, like, why are these pictures so ugly? I can't seem to get it out of my head, right? And so finally what happened was I gave up painting and I started doing some other things, you know, including sculpture and whatever. And I learned a lot from that, which is absorbing more things. And particularly, I was working in the museum anthropology. I saw a lot of Native American, Indian stuff that I was really attracted to. There was a different way of approaching things. And finally, I got to that end. And then to the end, you know, I was now in an MFA program. I was in painting. I wasn't doing any painting. I was not doing any sculpture. And finally, I got to a point I wasn't doing any art for a whole year. Now, try to exist in a graduate program, which you have done nothing, but being quite negative. As a fact, one professor said, like, in a seminar, I said, Chan, I've had a snoot full of your negativity. That's where I was. It was a very, very difficult position. And the position has to do, I finally kind of understood it. I mean, not even at that moment, I understood it, because I was existing in a period in which painting was dead. So you're put in a funny paradox. On the one hand, you want to be avant-garde, painting is dead, you can't paint anymore. But on the other hand, you're a painter. You got to paint. So I went through a whole period, a very, very innovative period, actually, that was a period of, in a sense, what I call anti-painting. You could paint and not paint at the same time, okay? Which is interesting, and it's like it's very, very good work, and I don't mean to downgrade it whatsoever. And I remember when I was doing this anti-painting, this period, you know, I was no longer doing any drawing, any kind of representational art whatsoever. I was just working on the physicality of the materials and doing that. So it was anti-painting. So as a matter of fact, I got to a point where I actually took images, like slides of my personal work and my students' work, and I used it and made a painting out of it, denying the photograph, which is even more representational to that. Well, I was working at this piece. It was on a wire fence. I was hanging paint on it, so it was definitely painting in one sense. And it was about to finish. And because I want to, you know, when you're doing a painting, you want to like at some point put it up and get a distance and take a look at it, look at the whole and see how you feel about it. So I was about to drive a nail into the wall to hang it up, but because it's not in a museum exhibition, you could put the nail roughly anywhere, you know, within reason. It's good enough. Okay, it doesn't have to be exact. But I asked a very, very deep question that was important. I said, well, yeah, this nail could be driven anywhere, but it will be somewhere. Okay. And I wanted to ask, like, where should this nail be? Where will this nail be? Well, it could be anywhere. Okay. Within reason, not anywhere, but anywhere within reason. And I thought about it for quite a while, just asking this actually kind of metaphysical question, not about painting, but about, you know, theory and practice. You know, it could be anywhere, but it's going to be somewhere exactly. And I finally decided, God, you know, it's going to be 7 feet 8 inches from the studio floor. Well, I have to measure the difference between the frame and the whatever. So, you know, short of that, but the painting itself will be 7 feet 8.5 inches from the floor. And I remember I did that because I wanted to walk into my studio every day and remind myself that 7 feet, 8.5 inches was actually the world high jumping record at that time. And there was a guy somewhere in the world who asked a very silly question. How high is high? Not for God, but for a human being, right? And I said, that's a stupid question, but I'm glad somebody did it, right? I applaud him for doing it, asking that question. Imagine 8 hours a day, just jumping, right? Just to find out how high is the human potential. And I swear, every time I walk into the studio, I said to myself, if I'm not striving for that, I need to give up painting. Because I'm asking a question, maybe it's a deeper question, but no longer as no more, let's say, important as the guy asking a stupid question, how high is high? And that was the moment I realized that a certain kind of negation was important to negate myself, as well as to negate the history of art. And that was the moment I began to, in a sense, realize I have been living in a period in which, in a sense, questioning yourself, questioning your desires, your hopes, whatever your dreams are, is an important part to go beyond the limitation of what you are. And actually, that was a point that I became a little bit more comfortable about doing art, because I knew I have asked that question. I knew I was comfortable with it. And I want to bring back to the metaphor about the ice pick is important, and you mentioned that before. Many people do not understand Dada because they think it's such a negative thing, right? And what Dada did was to open up another dimension, and I particularly love Duchamp. I love Duchamp this whole period. I still do. He questioned the fact that we all know that a door is either open or closed. We know that. What he did was he constructed a room, three rooms actually, in which there's an entry room, and then there's a entry to two other rooms. And there was a door, but there was only one door, and the door could be opened to one and closed to the other. Right? It could be open and closed, closed and open. It could be open and open. I guess it can't be closed and closed. Very interesting. I said, well, he really opened up the middle, right? He was taking an ice pick to the whole concept. The things either are open and closed. And what he did was created an opening. Because the ice pick, iconoclasm, is an important part of the whole structure of moving forward. Because you know the thing that supports you, that you're comfortable with, is also the thing that closes the door. But what that means is that you are in a situation in which is not simply a matter of moving forward. You are always in a position of equivocation, right? So what I understood now, and I love Hans Hofmann for that, is he talked about push-pull actually happens in a work of art. Because what push-pull does is that, on the one hand, it pushes you to the object, but it pulls you back to, I guess, your own thoughts. Push-pull. And what the push-pull does is put you in this sort of ambiguous space in which you always have to try to figure out what the heck is it? And I think learning to exist in in a destabilized existence and being somewhat comfortable with that allows you to, in a sense, maneuver in a world that's constantly changing. It's very difficult, but I think if you only have the push without the pull, or you only have the pull without the push, it just wouldn't work. So that relationship between the figure and the ground, the push-pull, actually, in some sense, creates a dynamism that, in a sense, even though it's a still painting, creates an absence that allows for openings to happen. That's why a work of art, in some sense, and this gets back to, like, I guess, philosophy and art in some sense, is that it never gives you a complete picture. So there's always a gap, an opening for an audience to pull out of the picture a different dimension of possibilities. What a total representation is an illusion. They say, yes, that's a real good illustration of a tree, I remember going to Italy when I was in Florence. One of the painters I was extremely disappointed in, a painter that I absolutely loved, I was disappointed was Botticelli, because Botticelli was a really good illustrator. But he didn't have the sort of, how should I say, the love and touch for the painting that meant that he was almost making love to the painting as he was doing it. So dancing, and that gets back to the thing about interrogative and interrogative. Yes, at some point you have to put yourself in the interrogative mode. Okay, that's like when you're facing a situation that was extreme. You put the guy you put yourself and the guy under the headlights. As where were you last night and whatever, and even and it really reminded me of, let's say, what is it, Francis Bacon? We will put nature under the rack and extract the information. Okay, and I thought that was a little aggressive, the interrogative mode, right?
Yes.
I think the interrogative mode, I think, is a kind of almost a naive version. It's an important mode at a certain point that you need that degree of negation. But only when you get to beyond that, you get to a comfortable position of dancing with the painting, dancing with the situation in the interrogative mode, and which you are actually responding in a way that's not so definitely aggressive that the other person just want to shut up. Nature is just say, go ahead, put me in the rack. I will never yield my secret. It's learning how to dance, the dance of life, the dance of the seven veils. I think most people don't understand how to make that dance.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I do, but at least I understand the idea. So that's it,
Yeah.
the dance of the seven veils.
Thank you, Phil. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up for today, and next week we'll pick up with the text. But I just kind of wanted to walk us through some of that trail of breadcrumbs. So,
Okay, thank you, Rick.
have a
Thanks,
great week,
Dave.
everybody.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah.
Thanks
See
a
you
lot.
next time.